This week, we present, first up, the security news. We're going to discuss how ransomware is growing at 118%, as cyber criminals adopt fresh tactics and code innovations. Period tracker apps share data with Facebook. Did I read that? Anyway, U.S. Cyber Command trolls North Korea with a malware release, and a whole lot more. How gamification, how I don't buy it at all. A new vulnerability in Intel CPUs. How I have some thoughts on firmware and attack vectors, and I want you to prove me wrong. And all that and more. On our second segment, Peter Smith, the founder and CEO of Edgewise, we'll be talking about some really interesting challenges when it comes to security in AWS and Amazon's AWS cloud. Some really, really interesting stuff. Peter's got some awesome content on it, so I'm excited. We'll then air some pre-recorded interviews from the Social Engineering Village with Chris Kirsch and Mika. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Effectively securing your organization and its reputation requires a smarter approach. To maximize efficiency and minimize risk, security experts turn to LogRhythm, the only leading solution built solely for security teams by a security team committed to your success. With Next-Gen SIEM, user and entity behavior analytics, network traffic and behavior analysis, security automation and orchestration, and compliance, LogRhythm provides security made smarter. Is your IT team ready to face the next implementation or upgrade? Do you have a pool of talented team members who are trained and ready to support your organization's growth? The right IT skills development platform can get you past the IT skills gap. With training content that's so engaging, some even call it binge-worthy learning, your team will watch and learn more with IT Pro TV. Get a free team trial of IT Pro TV today. Visit securityweekly.com/IT Pro TV. Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIEM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/securityweekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today.
Hello, welcome to Security Weekly. I would like to introduce you to a man whose hat is not nearly as cool as my bald head. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Paul Asadoorian.
Welcome to Paul's Security Weekly. This is episode 619, being recorded on September 12th, 2019, right here in G-Unit Studios, although most of our hosts, in fact, all of our hosts for this segment right now, are on the lines remotely. Starting with Mr. Lee Neely. Lee, welcome.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here from the home Idaho office. Looking forward to a great show. Cheers.
Fresh off the heels of DerbyCon, you and Mr. Jeff Mann, who's also on the lines remotely. Jeff, welcome.
I am fresh off the heels of a lot of bourbon in Louisville, and DerbyCon was very special, and we have something very special planned for everybody as soon as Mark can get to it, but I know it's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, well, I won't spoil it, but we have a lot of footage, and we've been using the word like documentary. I don't know how appropriate that is, but it's fairly appropriate. The opposite of appropriate, rather, is Mr. Joff Thayer, who's with us, very bald.
Oh no, you had that right the first time. I'm just sad that I wasn't there at the last DerbyCon. I actually had a record going. I'd been to every single DerbyCon except this year, so my own fault. But I'm looking forward.
Oh, dude, you could have got a challenge, one of those special challenge coins, and a black badge and all that. No,
I'm looking forward to see the documentary or the whatever we're calling
We'll call it pseudo documentary for now, in case it doesn't turn out that way. But
Does Sudo make me a documentary?
yeah, yes, that too. It's very nerdy. Exciting news about our webcast program. We're partnering with ISC Squared as an official CPE provider. If you attend any of our webcasts, you get 1 CPE credit per webcast. You can go to securityweekly.com/webcast and get all the ones that we're about to do, or /on demand, which takes you to the ones we did. We did the one with Jeff and Steve from Logarithm, and it was really awesome. I'm telling you what, if you're considering putting or using services in the cloud and want to understand the factors that go behind security decisions, this is the webcast for you. Jeff and Steve are both DevOps engineers that put Logarithms, were the primary people putting Logarithms product in the cloud as a SaaS offering. So I learned a ton in this webcast. So what else? That's it for webcasts. Hacker Halted will be in Atlanta, Georgia, October 10th through the 11th. Jeff and I will be there presenting. EC Council is also offering a $100 discount to our listeners for the 2-day conference. If you use the discount code HH19SW, you can go to securityweekly.com/hackerhalted as well and register there. And now we're going to do the security news first, which is kind of weird. Normally we do that last, but we're doing it first. So I'll turn it over to our illustrious panel. Is there a story that you would like to start with? I only had 17 stories this week.
Yeah, really.
But
I only had 13. But Jeff, did you have one that jumped out at you, or?
Oh, DNS. Oh, God, DNS over HTTPS. What an abysmal thing to do to DNS. Yeah, I want to do that one.
Let's do that one.
So there's a number of reasons I'm not really excited about this. I do understand why, right? Because you don't want people snooping on your DNS queries. So I guess, like Jaffa, you're alluding to, HTTPS is one way that you can accomplish that. Are there other ways to protect your recursive queries, Joff, cryptographically?
Yeah, there are. There's a number of things, right?
I've looked into this before. It's really confusing, and there's a lot of options, but...
Yeah, there is. First of all, you've got to go back and remember historically, and I am channeling Paul Vixie here, who I literally had a conversation with last year at Wild West Hackin' Fest about this very topic. And, to paraphrase Paul for a minute, he was absolutely dismayed at the concept that DNS would be transported over the HTTPS protocol. And one of the reasons is the original design, and this is me speaking now, the original design of DNS is a distributed name system. There is a caching resolver that is close to you on your local network.
Also, UDP, so that it's fast, and so
it's fast.
The protocol, the protocol on top of UDP, right, takes care of some of the issues you have with a connectionless protocol. So
if you do appropriately have a caching resolver deployed on your network, the leakage of data is much less because you'll only get the first thing it needs in its cache until that TTL expires. And so you're not always transmitting DNS requests out across the internet. You're transporting them just across your local network for the most part.
But my caching server still needs to go out to the internet to get.
It does. It needs to refresh its cache when the TTL expires. There's no doubt about that. So here's the other thing.
Well, wait. Hold on. Go back to that for a second, Joff. Can your caching recursive name server locally use DNSSEC to talk to either the root or other DNS servers to go get those initial queries and cache them? That would be. Is that an appropriate usage?
Well, you're mixing two concepts. Remember, DNSSEC is more about appropriate validation that the correct answer got to the caching server.
Right.
It is not about encryption.
It's not about. It's not about the privacy.
It's an HMAC like mechanism, right?
It's more for integrity, not privacy. Does that sound
correct?
Okay.
Yeah,
gotcha.
It's more about integrity, not privacy. So okay, great. But there is a specification for DNS actually over TLS, which few people are aware of.
Oh,
and
no,
that is,
I read about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is actually opportunistic on behalf of the resolvers. The port number is 953, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And DNS will attempt to negotiate a resolver-to-resolver TLS connection if that is configured and available to it. So, the fact that we are reinventing the protocol and sending it over HTTPS, I think is I just don't see it as a good idea. I mean, it's actually going against the design of the original protocol, and there has already been efforts to appropriately implement TLS into the DNS protocol in the proper way, assuming that you're running a resolver that is geographically near to you. Now, you don't care if your client system is talking to a resolver on your local network. That's right. It. That's local by definition. Right?
But now, what I don't understand is this is being talked about as DNS over HTTPS coming to Chrome. But doesn't Chrome make a call to the operating system, or no? Does it?
Normally, Chrome should be resolving DNS against the operating system.
It would have to. I mean, it has to look at my host. Well, I mean, that's not a DNS lookup, but it does look at my host file, for example.
Well, what they're doing is wrecking that stack, right? They're instead nailing up an HTTPS connectivity from the browser off to some DNS resolver, probably at Google.
Right. So they're bypassing my operating system's DNS resolver?
So who's looking at your DNS now? I mean, seriously. I mean, this actually bothers me. I'm not happy about it.
This stinks for a lot of reasons.
It is against the protocol design. And for crap's sake, I will again paraphrase Paul. In fact, I will quote Paul Vixie on this. I asked him, what do you think of Google's resolver at 8.8.8.8? Okay. Paul did not at that time make a disparaging comment about Google. Paul's response to me was, there's a lot of sheep in human DNA. And his response, and I shit you not, was directly aimed at the idea that DNS by design was designed so that you run a local distributed resolver. Right. It is not a centralized protocol. And it just, I'm furious about this entire direction of DNS in general. I think it's a disaster. It should never have happened, and we should stick with the RFCs where DNS can opportunistically negotiate TLS between the resolvers. That's the way to do it correctly, and that's where I'm staying.
There's just too many variables for me in terms of, can it actually make the SSL connection? Does it look into my host file? Does it fall back to regular DNS? And then what about all the other applications on my system? How are they going to be resolving? Like you're saying, Job, DNS is meant to be versatile like that, and it doesn't matter. Like the point is, I get an answer. The how is all those different scenarios that DNS will go through to attempt to resolve the name, on top of what your operating system does in looking in host files and other things, largely which is broken in today's Linux systems.
I totally get the privacy angle, but honestly, you can configure your own stub resolver that forwards to nobody but the root servers, which are Anycast routable.
But then my ISP can see that unless I put that resolver. If I put that resolver on Amazon's or somewhere on the internet, right? And then I'm
you SSL. Don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. You want to put the resolver in your local network and send the caching recursive queries up to the root. Your ISP, if they look at that, they are looking and snooping on your traffic. Sure, that's potentially a problem, right? But you're not sending your DNS queries to a central authority. You're sending it to the roots, which are trusted across the internet.
Right, but they can snoop on it, and I think that's the point of putting it over HTTPS is so that it can't be snooped.
That's the privacy concern, and so look, why are we not talking about proper DNS over TLS between the caching resolvers? Because that's where the discussion should be.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Sorry, Lee.
The other thing is, didn't a few years ago we went through a lot of trouble for DNS security? You didn't allow port 53 direct out from any old host, TCP or UDP. You put it to the resolver and the local resolver, and it was a thing that could talk to the internet because there was a lot of bogus crap out there.
That's the right way to do it, Lee.
That's the right way to do it. Here's the other thing. Remember, when you have a centralized resolver on your local network, there's not individual client identification. I mean, I did this for large universities. There was 15 to 20,000 subscribers talking to 2 servers. Okay? Mm-hmm. Those 2 servers were responsible for the DNS resolution. The only thing an outside party knew was what those 2 servers were sending up to the routes, right? If they chose to look. That's the way the thing is designed.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. It does anonymize your internal IP and look like the resolvers are going out to get the answer. That is right. A good point, John.
So this is an abomination. I mean, it just makes me furious.
Yeah.
But
I imagine the troubleshooting of having things not work from the browser and work from the OS or vice versa. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
It resolves it one way at the OS and another way in the browser.
Yeah, see, that's a disaster alone, even if you don't take the, big sandhill that I just stood on, right? I mean, that's there's no good words, right? Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean you reinvent it badly. Right. I mean, come on.
It's a great quote, Jeff. Jeff, did you want to weigh in?
I was going to ask someone to just play devil's advocate or just at least say, what was the goal? What were they trying to accomplish here? Albeit poorly, according to Jeff.
Yeah, well, I think the goal is privacy, and I think to make it really easy for the average user to configure their browser and or their phone, because there's options that you can put on your smartphones that will basically protect the privacy of your DNS lookups. So if someone were to look at them over the network, it would be encrypted. So they can't see what website you're going to, right?
But you're trading that off. You're trading that off with the data analytics that the provider of the DNS is going to derive from you.
Yes.
Right.
So conceivably, because of bills that have been rescinded, conceivably they could say, well, people are going to Netflix more so than anywhere else. So guess what? When you use Netflix, you have to pay an extra fee to the ISP and things of that nature. Now, I think a great technical solution to that, if you're concerned about your ISP snooping on you, is to stand up a DNS server somewhere on the internet, create a secure tunnel to it from your ISP to that server on the internet, and then let it do your DNS resolution. And heck, have 2 of them, right? One in Amazon's cloud, one on DigitalOcean or whatever, and do it that way. That way, your traffic is encrypted to your resolver. Your resolver is doing DNS like the world intended, and albeit a little bit of a hack, I think better than just trusting randomly that Google's going to send your DNS traffic over HTTPS. I think we've beat a dead horse. I don't know.
Well, my only comment, you made the statement, and Jeff made a similar statement about average, yours is more recent, so it's in my memory banks. The average user can configure his browser, and my first thought is the average user doesn't configure anything.
That's true.
They just use. So, maybe we know better, but is there a benefit if we can all take a deep breath and step back to the real average user that has no idea what we're even talking about, but needs to have some sort of general protection or I don't trust Google or anybody to think that they're being completely altruistic. But
I agree, Jeff. I think there's a level of training in terms of privacy that is separate from security that needs to happen to the general population that may not understand that if you use your cable provider's email and their DNS servers, that there could be potentially some privacy impacts and really interesting things that happen, like when you host your email, for example, and you want to switch ISPs. Well, now your email is there, right? And just basic things. People I talk to are still in that situation.
Right. All right. Horse beaten.
Okay. Well, speaking of user training, so there was this whole article on the gamification and how it can be used to provide a level of awareness and training to your employees. And I tell you what, and this largely comes from Ira Winkler, and Ira and I had a conversation at Layer 8 conference, and I thought it was really, really prolific. In fact, I hope Ira gets a chance to talk more about this. In fact, we should probably bring him on the show to talk about it, because I bring it up every time now we talk about end-user education. Basically, it was what I said when we interviewed Chris Hadnagy, is that rather than teaching people to look for things that might be malicious and teaching them what's malicious and what's not, why don't you just create hard and fast rules to prevent the bad after effects from happening if they fall for a phish? Because I believe the attackers are always going to have some new mechanism, some new technique, some new tool, some new tactic, some new script, some new thing that is going to trick a user. And the real way to protect yourself is to put processes in place that say, if whatever situation happens, I do this and not this. Similar to the security guard we were talking about with Chris Hadnagy a couple of weeks ago. So these things that say, well, gamification is the way to do it. The American Psychological Association says competition increases psychological and physiological activation which prepares employees' minds for increased effort and enables higher performance. And higher performance leads to, get this, higher performance means being better able to detect and thwart security threats. And that's what the statement I have issue with. Just because you have higher performance doesn't mean that your ability to detect whether something is an attack or not has increased. If you don't have that fundamental knowledge, you're not going to detect it. If the attackers are using something different, really higher performance means you're just going to get pwned faster.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, throughout history, if we can go that far, hackers who are often described in the media as sophisticated and using sophisticated attacks, we know that they usually exploit something relatively simple, like, say, weak passwords.
Yep.
And they're also, for the most part, and I know there's always an exception, but for the most part, they're going after targets of opportunity. They find some way to break into something and they go see who's vulnerable to it, and then they see if there's some way they can monetize what they've found. So, the whole idea, I have a problem with gamification, as do you. I don't think security is a game. I think it's a puzzle. It's a big difference. But I also think that, as soon as we train our users to, not do one thing, the hackers, the bad guys will come up with some variation, as you said, that will defeat them. Somewhat of a case in point, I got an email about a week ago, ostensibly from our internal security department, saying we did a recent phishing activity and you clicked on something and now you have to take remedial training. And I don't object to taking remedial training if, in fact, I did click on something, but I'm usually pretty good at catching stuff. And if something got by me, I would like to know about it. So I wrote to
I thought this was going somewhere different. I thought there was a link in the email you had to click on, and that was the phish, because that would be an awesome phish.
Well, wait for the punchline, Paul. You're getting ahead of yourself. Sorry. I shot an email to the security office and said, "Hey, what was the thing that I clicked on?"
Yeah.
And they said, well, we don't have the details, but you should sign up for the training. So yes, in the original email, it had a link to click on to sign up for this remedial training, to which I commented back to my security group, it's kind of funny that the behavior that you're trying to correct in me, you're encouraging me to do. So I'm kind of like, I'm not clicking on it,
right?
And we'll wait and see what happens. So I tweeted about it anonymous. I was like, I didn't say it. People can connect the dots now if they're listening, but I didn't say it was my own company. I'm not going to say what the vendor is that we're using. But, it just seemed kind of weird that, you're asking me to click on a link because I supposedly clicked on a bad link. That, even if it's not a phish, it just seems like a stupid way to reinforce good behaviors or discourage you from bad behaviors. Just a thought.
Yeah, well, email phishing is difficult in this context, right? Because you can't say never click on a link or never open an attachment. Because even as a security people, we know that sometimes we have to click a link in email and click an attachment. And then it comes down to, well, who do you trust, right? And that's out the window. I think
I've pretty much decided I should just never click on a link again.
Pretty much. I mean, because as Joff will attest to, once you compromise one user in the organization, what if you were to use that account to send phishing emails to other people? Well, then it's coming from, hey, Jeff at Security Weekly sent me an email. Well, I trust Jeff. I'll click the link, the email address, I can check all those things, right?
Right.
It's harder with links. I think file attachments can be solved to a certain extent, right? There's other ways, I think, to more securely share files, and furthermore, not just securely share the files, but trust who's giving you the file. I think we're further along in that technology, would be my assessment. But links are hard, because then once email, so you make the rule like, I'm not going to click an email. That's a bad rule, because someone's going to send it to you in Slack, someone's going to text it to you via SMS, or send it to you via Twitter DM, whatever the case may be, right? LinkedIn. I mean, there's a million different ways to send people messages now. I really think people are sticking with email because it still works, and all their tools are built around email. When that stops working, they're going to start picking these other ways to send people stuff, and they're still going to be successful, in my opinion.
I agree. I guess at the end of the day, I think in terms of security awareness for the user workforce at a company, I think there's more to it than just simply teaching them not to click links, or more generically teaching them not to fall for a phishing attack. Or, to be more specific, as you said, the phishing attack, the phishing attempt, whether we come up with a clever variation of the name for it depending on the attack platform, but it can come from anywhere.
Right.
I just think there's more to it to that, which is probably goes to what Ira and Chris are saying about, why don't we redirect things to the more positive behaviors and the absolutes that will prevent the bad things from happening, rather than sort of focusing on the negative elements of it. I am curious to hear what Ira has to say about it, so let's get him on the show.
Absolutely.
I think the other one
go ahead,
thing
Jeff.
Just as a last comment on that, all of us are susceptible, right? I love clicking on shit. Send me the right stuff, I'll click on it.
Right.
I mean, it's a trust issue, and trust can be exploited.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. So, Joff, you trust me to click. I put a link in Slack earlier. You probably clicked on it, right? Because you thought it came from me. But that's not the point. Joff and I will trust each other, right? But what if Joff's not really Joff? Or what if someone's impersonating Joff? That's the real, I think, one of the real problems with all of this is how do you verify the identity, and how do you know who is trustworthy? But not who, but if you can trust that identity at that particular time.
Yeah.
How much do you trust CVSS? Any comments on CVSS?
Wow. That could get deep.
I mean, we were going version 2 or version 3?
But, okay.
Well, Gunter Alleman wrote an article this week about CVSS, and basically it can be summarized as what we've always said about CVSS, right? He says, I would caution any bug hunter, security analyst, software vendor, or device manufacturer to not rely on CVSS as the pointy end of the stick for prioritizing remediation. It is an important variable in the risk calculation, but it is not an adequate risk qualifier by itself. I think he summed it up very nicely.
But does he go on to say what is? Because, again, lacking any other resource, and I'm curious as to whether he was referring to version 2 or version 3. But a lot of people don't have anything else to work with. But I think more than anything, this is sort of a recent trend, and we know some of the other companies that are doing this. We've found all the vulnerabilities, and I've seen the statistics. I can't quote them exactly, but something like 85% of the vulnerabilities out there score on the CVSS ranking. Whatever the number is, that means they got to do something about it based on, how far into the show did we get before I said PCI?
Well, I think, Jeff, it comes down for me that what CVSS lacks in terms of what in your own organization and what you're missing, right? And if you're saying that organizations don't have anything else, they haven't created the process to do that, because it's not something else you need per se. It is
well, in a word, it needs context.
It needs
That's the word.
Is it two things? Is it probability and impact that it's missing related to your own organization, or those can't be the only two things? Those are the two things that come to mind. But I think probability and impact. Use kind of is it fair that is the risk assessment?
Probability and impact pertain to the risk. The vulnerability is the vulnerability, and I think part of the confusion is we try to complicate this thing by trying to simplify it too much. If that makes sense.
Does the CVSS score even matter if I have a method for measuring probability and impact? If it's a CVSS 1.0, it could still be a very high probability and have a very severe impact, right? So in that context, CVSS means nothing to me if I can do probability and impact.
Right.
It all comes down to local context, and that's what's missing, right? I mean, it's nice to have a base measure that gives a place as a starting point, right? But that's really all it is. It's the rest is a local context, local impact, and organizations, either have their act together on that or they don't. And we see people that are all over the map. Some understand the assets they're dealing with, understand that the risks that they're prioritizing against, and have a very good matrix that takes CVSS into account, but it doesn't treat it as the primary score.
Yeah, I think ease of exploitability is a good thing that CVSS helps define, but you still have to extrapolate into probability and impact. Lee?
Well, I was going to say, you remember when they had all the hubbub about vulnerabilities in medical devices, and then it all calmed down because you had to be like 2 feet from a person. That doesn't mean it's not an unfortunate exploit, but you're not exploiting that from across the pond. You've got to be right next to somebody to do something. Or, in the context of your company, you have a hugely vulnerable system, but you've built firewalls and other devices and segmented it and all this stuff that it's still vulnerable, but you need that context.
Right.
And I just look at the score by itself. Doesn't work.
It's interesting you say that, Lee, because the Logitech keyboard ones, actually Sam told me about this one, that you can basically hack into wireless keyboards that in turn can execute commands on your system. And they said, well, they can do that, remotely, and they don't need an internet connection. They just need to be in range. And I'm like, well, isn't it more of a probability that you're going to be attacked if you're connected to the internet than not? Because that means someone has to be in physical proximity. Now, what I will say is some of the most interesting, specifically wireless attacks that I really have not seen, certainly at any scale. When we were writing the book and doing threat modeling and brainstorming, it was always like it'd be really interesting if we took this Logitech keyboard attack, right? And we said, well, someone has to physically be there. And I'm like, well, someone doesn't necessarily need to physically be there. Someone just needs to have control of a device with the right hardware and software on it to be able to exploit the vulnerability. And I always thought that one of the coolest vulnerabilities and attacks you could ever construct would be if you took something ubiquitous and off the shelf, like a Windows laptop with even a certain chipset of Wi-Fi, and you could turn that into something malicious that could attack something like a keyboard or attack something like an access point or attack something wirelessly. Now you've just really opened up the attack surface. I think we benefit from the ubiquitous nature of technology and computing in that those attacks are much less feasible because of that. And so it was Dan Kaminsky, right, that did the work about, what was it called, where monolithic, versus ubiquitous computing, right? Because there's different versions of technology, we largely can't pull off those attacks at scale. But I truly believe that that's coming at some point on some scale.
So I think I can summarize what's wrong with this article up in the second paragraph, where the statement is the security industry has always struggled to score, in quotes, the significance of the threat posed by a newly discovered vulnerability. Threats are something else. Vulnerabilities are something else. I think what they're trying to say is more like, the impact or the probability or the likelihood. I think that's what they're trying to say. But when you start throwing these terms together, trying to simplify these things, I think that's where people go off. I don't see anywhere in the article where he suggests the alternative, which is fine. If you have a problem with CVSS, great. To finish my earlier thought, I think a lot of the vulnerability companies are struggling with, we've discovered all these thousands and millions of vulnerabilities, and now we've got, what this article cites, bug bounty programs that are finding so many more vulnerabilities. And there was some conversation I overheard over this past weekend at DerbyCon about some of the dollars that were dropped on bug bounties in Vegas, I guess during DEF CON. And, people are like, there was a vulnerability, but it wasn't that big a deal. I'm paraphrasing grossly.
See, now I think this attack is what I described, though. Mm-hmm. It sounds like that he can infect a system through some other means, then use the Logitech wireless chipset to then infect other and snoop on keyboard strokes of other Logitech wireless keyboards that are vulnerable. Because the dongle, like a USB dongle that's plugged into your computer, what they described in the article is like basically it's got like a mini kind of maybe not operating system, but at least a system on a chip that you can control and take over to use to infect other things. That to me is really cool because it really changes how you would evaluate that vulnerability, that threat, that type of attack against your organization, right? Because it opens up more of the attack surface.
Well, we should have a separate section on, or a separate discussion on the risk equation sometime, and try to drill down on this. I hear what you're saying. Back when I first learned risk equations back in the DoD, to your point, talking about the probability or the impact, we looked at it in two different ways. The probability that an attack would be launched. We called them attacks back then, that would actually be attempted, and then the probability or the likelihood that if launched, it would be successful. And very often,
I agree.
If somebody could get to it and try it, it would be completely successful. So a lot of emphasis and weight was placed on the likelihood or the probability that somebody could actually get to the point where they could do the exploitation. I think that's sort of what you're touching on.
I agree, Jeff, that probability and impact are very multidimensional, right? There's a lot of different factors that go into each one of those categories.
But again, if not using the CVSS, what's somebody supposed to use or rely on?
Well, I think it's how you use the CVSS, right?
Exactly.
Use that to.
That was actually a point I was going to make. I've gotten data calls where it's like, for this system, how many vulnerabilities CVSS score of 8 and above have been around for more than 30 days? And it's like, well, yeah, but where's the context of whether they matter? You're just asking for how many I got. But that's a compliance mindset, right?
And there's so many statistics out there about, well, vulnerabilities that are X number of days old are either exploited or not exploited, and breaches happen, and historically and all that stuff. But that's still someone else's data that they're like, it's not you, right? So to look at age and then look at the data that's been collected about breaches, for example, and apply that to, well, I don't need to fix things that are less than 30 days old because according to statistics, they're not exploited, right, as often or whatever. I agree. I think that's bad practice. It's bad practice. I actually think in this case that you should just patch stuff and have a process for patching stuff. Not worry about doing all the fancy analytics. Being like, there's a patch available. Let's just apply it and move forward. And I truly believe applying that
easier said than done in the enterprise.
Right.
So I found a sentence towards the end that I do agree with, and I think sums up where he's going, and I would agree with it, except for I think I know what he's saying. I'm not sure if it's clearly stated. And the sentence is simply, CVSS isn't and should never be used as a risk score. And what I hear him saying is people see the CVSS score, as a result of the scan engine, and they act upon it without applying any of the other things that we've been talking about, like probability or impact, which is basically assigning risk.
Right.
Where is the device or system in question in your network? Is this an internet exploitable, remotely exploitable vulnerability that's sitting on a system that's 20 layers deep in your network and only 2 people have access to it? Those are the types of things that people too often have just taken the raw score or whatever the score is from scan engines and acted upon it without applying any kind of, what does this mean to my environment? What does this mean to the systems in my environment? And I think that's what's missing, and I think that's what we're all agreeing on, including the author or the person that they...
But I think using in the context of scanning is important, because you may see this really high severity vulnerability in RDP, look at the systems you know about and go, I use largely Linux systems, and the Windows systems I have are all either not vulnerable or not running RDP, so I'm good. However, in your scanning engine, the high CVSS score that's exploiting Bluekeep, did I get that right? Is it Bluekeep?
It's Bluekeep.
Bluekeep, right? If that does appear in my network, then it's a high priority, right? And so your scanning engine should absolutely use CVSS for things like that.
Well, pulling the Bluekeep thread for a second, I mean, my number 6 is basically that up until just recently, there wasn't a published exploit for Bluekeep, so the risk of exploit was much lower. Now there's a Metasploit framework has a Bluekeep exploit, so it changes the need and nature of patching Bluekeep. I mean, I don't want to pull the why have you got that exposed to the network or why is it on when it doesn't have to be. I'm just saying it changes the risk model around.
Well, and that exploit in Metasploit is somewhat neutered in a couple of different ways.
But yeah, okay. But that
for good reason. I think Rapid7 and the Metasploit team are being both responsible and allowing researchers to do their research, and people who want to test for the vulnerability. Right? They're trying to get the best of both worlds, and so I get it. And they're also quoted as stating that they're not going to necessarily leave it in the state that it's in today, which requires some knowledge and or skill, depending on what your goals are and what targets you have. They're not going to leave it that way forever. They're like, this. If that's the way it is for now, that might change. We might essentially make it easier for people to use this exploit down the road.
That's your degree of exploitability, right? I mean, how easily can it be exploited? What's it take? That's part of the equation in terms of how much you care about a given vulnerability.
I completely agree. I think ease of exploitability absolutely plays a factor in the equation, which is a hard thing to measure sometimes too.
So,
meanwhile, back at the ranch, NSA, trying to keep up with cybersecurity initiatives, has engaged in a reorganization. My article number 5. I won't dwell on it, but I can't tell you how many reorgs I lived through in the mere 10 years I was there.
Gotcha.
Right.
Yeah, that's...
Hey, can we talk about the Netcat story? Because that thing makes me really laugh out loud.
Sure.
Yeah,
let's
it's short for network cache attack. It's a side channel vulnerability that could allow users to sniff out sensitive data, and they quote, such as someone's SSH password. Although from reading the article, it looks like going back to ease of exploitability, that it's very opportunistic and therefore got a pretty low severity rating. But Intel's recommendation for disabling performance optimization features also has me very worried, mostly because I write really crappy code and I need all the help I can get to make my apps run fast.
Yeah, but really to the point, who the heck would name their exploit Netcat, for fuck's sake?
Oh, yeah, and then there's that.
Come on.
Well, how about NC for short?
Oh, that's a great idea, Jeff.
That's unique.
Yeah, there's a little bit of name collision there going on. Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and here I always thought that referred to Norton Commander, but no.
Look, I'm going to give him a break. Maybe it's lost in translation. After all, they were an Aston.
Right. My story number 5 I thought was interesting. I pulled a quote out from an article that was titled "Firmware: A New Attack Vector requiring industry leadership, which piqued my interest. They state in the article, the emergence of firmware as a new attack vector has reignited an age-old debate within the industry. Who is responsible for addressing device cybersecurity? Is the device manufacturer or the company purchasing the device? The chicken and egg problem, blah, blah, blah. Now, first, firmware attacks are not a new attack vector by any stretch of the imagination. Second, the device manufacturer absolutely must be held responsible, at least in some capacity. It's their device, their product, largely their software. I mean, they could be using other people's software, but so they have some responsibility, if not a lot of responsibility. Third, just as we would purchase software as a company and do our due diligence to make sure that it meets our requirements, which should include security, you are also responsible for discovering any vulnerabilities, backdoors, or misconfigurations that also apply to your firmware. Why is that any different from anything else, right? Prove me wrong.
Well, you remember when firmware updates, which used to be difficult, you had to do things like put jumpers on the motherboard and or basically boot off of something instead of updating, and now you can kind of just update them in line with your OS patches.
Yeah,
that
but
worries me
you
a
know
little
what's
bit,
funny,
'cause
though?
that makes it easy to put bogus stuff in there.
Yeah, you know what's funny? That opens up a whole new attack vector, which I guess, I don't know if the article went on. I didn't see in the article where it explained this, but Lee, to your point, let's take motherboards, for example. Before UEFI, and long before lots of other BIOS versions and revisions, your BIOS update was a bootable DOS floppy, right? That you had to boot your system off of, and then it would go and use that software to update your operating system, and then you took that floppy out and rebooted your system, and you were off to the races. And that's how a BIOS firmware, anyway, back in the day was updated. Now, today, with UEFI, and so many manufacturers, and Eclipsium does great research on this, and I briefed with Lenovo on this as well. Now, today, it's all connected, right? So the operating system itself, to your point, Lee, you don't have to boot in the floppy anymore. That means the operating system has direct access to the firmware, hardware, and firmware that's running on it, and can access. But it's a lot of cases, it's a two-way street, right? I can write to that firmware can write to the operating system, and therefore it's increasingly becoming, I think, more of a serious problem and an attack vector. Although nothing certainly new. I mean, the early viruses, right, would overwrite your master boot record and corrupt your system. So it's always been that's always been in play, I guess I should say.
Now
Jeff,
they just send you a bill for the present. Oh wait, that's called ransom. Yeah.
Yes. Jeff, you got floppies.
I got floppies. Somebody mentioned floppies. This one right here is labeled Satan 1.0, released 4/5/95.
That's awesome.
I can't read it, but I've got it.
I mean, I hate to be nitpicky. It doesn't look very floppy to me. It looks kind of hard. So,
Right?
I mean, I actually have
He's
people.
just glad to see us.
I actually
That
have
begs the
people.
question: do I have any floppy disks?
Wait,
I think
Jeff-
they're all these.
Joff, are you going to say people don't know what this little save icon means?
Right.
Because that makes
No,
me feel really old when they say that.
But wait,
I've
close
got,
up.
I've got lots of stories, but
What
I
does
actually have
this
people-
do?
That's the
Yeah,
right.
what does
That's
that
the right.
do?
That's the right protector.
Right protect. Everybody knows that.
Not everybody.
Okay.
Hey,
What's the other hole for? Do you remember?
Paul? I'll let you take that one.
I had that was.
Did that-
that
hold
was the
on,
show
now
with
in all
high density.
serious-
Oh God.
In all seriousness, what did that other hole signify? Because it was either open or closed, right?
Well,
If I remember correctly.
so there was a write protect tab on one side, and
side.
the other side I thought was for the high density floppies that had that extra hole. That
yeah.
one.
That's the high density floppy sensor hole.
3 megs versus 1.4.
Okay. Yes.
Now I
I'm
gotta
gonna
look
go
at all
with
my
what
floppies
Lee
and see
said.
if they have a second hole. Oh wait, there's one without.
There you go.
There you go. That's a low density.
Or is it
This-
720K versus 1.4? 720K versus 1.4 megabytes. That's right.
That's right.
Wow, that's
That
not
was
a lot.
right.
Why do we know this stuff?
That was awesome, Lee. I if I knew that, I forgot it, or maybe never knew it. Maybe my floppies only had holes. I don't know.
I'll
Hey,
never.
I'm waiting for Jeff to
never
pull out a
forget,
flippy
though, I have to
floppy.
I have to tell a floppy story.
A floppy story. And we have a title for the episode. Thank you, Joff.
Bottoms up.
Floppy story.
Floppy story. No,
Floppy story.
My favorite floppy story. By the way, okay, completely.
Wait, you have more than one floppy story.
A completely ADD moment. I've got my Star Trek glass here.
Very nerdy.
Oh,
Nice.
baby.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm not fucking around.
Is it the
Okay.
is it the voyage home where they go back in time
Yeah, I think it is.
with the
But
whales and
it's
stuff? That was
movie.
on TV the other morning. I had that kind of on in the
And
background.
they've got this big ass tank. inside the
Yeah.
ship.
That's
And
Star
Scotty's
Trek
going, "Hello,
4, I
computer," to the mouse.
Yeah, with
I'm
with
out.
the
Computer.
mouse.
Oh, wait.
Yeah,
Hello, computer.
that
Yeah.
was a classic.
Classic.
Okay, no, I got
Anyway.
to tell my floppy story now. All right, I had a so years ago I used to be, and I'm talking years ago, I used to be a consultant for faculty and students, and Paul's probably had this role as well. But anyway, one lovely young lady, and I always enjoyed it when lovely young ladies came to see me, for unknown reasons. But one one lovely young lady came in one day and she pulled out her little purse. She had one of those really cute pocketbooks and, anyway, she pulled out her floppy disk from her purse. And when she pulled it out, it was a 5 1/4. We're not talking a 3.5 inch days. Okay. It was it's a 5 1/4. And
It was
she
just
pulled it out.
excited to see you, Jeff.
She pulled it out and the thing is curved like this, right? And on the label, it was beautifully typewritten. And she says to me, I don't know why it's not working. Can you fix it? Anyway, that's my floppy story.
She put it through the typewriter, didn't she?
Totally put it
She
through the
put it
typewriter.
through the typewriter.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Well,
I
Sean,
don't-
as long as she didn't touch the little pill circle thing, she's all right, right?
Yeah. Look, full disclosure, I had stupid guys do stupid shit too. So
Yeah.
just to keep it equal opportunity here. But
Yeah, they tried to put these in the typewriter. Figure that
Yeah.
one out.
Right.
I did have a guy. I'll tell you, I had a guy come in, same thing, 5 1/4. He pulls it out of his back pocket and it's folded neatly into 4 pieces, and he was wondering why it wasn't working. Yeah.
Oh,
You know the
Hey.
shelf on the in the car behind the back seats that used to exist anyway for the coupes? You know that
Yeah.
is not a good place to store 9-track tapes in the sun?
Yeah, they tend to melt, don't they?
Yeah, I found that out. It was sad.
oh, I had one. I think for Jeff that he'll get a kick out of because he likes to poke at Bruce Schneier. I think you've come full circle, but
I
InfoSec
still poke at them.
InfoSec prophet Bruce Schneier is only as famous as half of Salt and Peppa. Salt and Peppa being the female rap group from the 90s. Push it real good. Yeah. So apparently they put together a list of popularity and there's security people on it. I don't know the whole thing. Redskins
It was
list.
based on Google search records or something like that.
Something
Not
ridiculous.
That they're tracking what we search for.
Numbers 4 and 5 apparently on the list are Bruce Schneier and Troy Hunt, respectively, who rank alongside Sandra Denton, Peppa from the 1980s hip-hop duo Salt and Peppa, and English football player Lucy Bronze, apparently plays French club something.
Well,
so-
hey, I added this one just because I remembered it just like 10 minutes ago, so I added it if you refresh. But a couple of our own got shout outs in the article that I posted about Google is finally going to fix a problem that they had with their calendar that was discovered by a couple Black Hills folks back in 2017.
Oh, nice.
We got
That
some
would be
press.
Mike Felch and
Mike
Bo
Felch
Bullock.
and Bo Bullock. We got some press over that, which is pretty
Yeah.
awesome. And we had to give Mike and Bo, appropriate, spankings or something. I don't know what
Yeah,
we gave.
the
But
afternoon off.
Cool.
Oh, yeah, Lee, you had a tampon or period store. Was it period like menstruation period? Is that what you're talking about?
So there are these mobile apps that are designed to track health things. This particular one was a period tracker. It was designed to track menstruation cycles and fertility. And it collected a lot of biometric data. which you can make a big data set from a bunch of users and then predict trends. That part, okay, but they were sharing that data with Facebook. So, Jane
could
Doe
possibly go
is
wrong?
going to be fertile today, is available on social media, or maybe even more sexual facts. They weren't sharing social security numbers. It was just kind of weird that they were doing that. I mean, the message is when you're tracking health information, be sure where that app is storing
Wait,
it.
so like it updated your status like is feeling fertile today? Is that
Pretty much. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, I could definitely see, building a big,
we know
database that could
exactly
be
what they were
queried, but
thinking.
holy crap.
I mean, that could be useful. Is feeling grumpy today, right? That would be.
Keep Mr. Happy
it's
away.
The day it's the day to bring home chocolate and flowers. Yep.
Yes.
Oh, that would be worth it. Never mind. Yes.
My wife, who thinks what we do is silly and doesn't have anything to do with this, she saw that on Facebook and was talking about it. So it made the real news.
Mm.
Yeah, and you said, you think what we do is silly?
Well,
Well, I mean,
if you want to get silly,
Well.
we could talk about XKCD.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I mean, it's really unfortunate their forum lost 560,000 accounts. But what got mine is that somebody did an analysis. Number one password in the dump was password, and number two is correct battery horse staple. You remember the KCD commercial? Use the passphrase.
oh, that
I
was
tell
an
people use the
excellent-
passphrase, but never use correct battery horse staple.
How Freudian or not?
Well, I guess correct battery horse staple one would be okay, right, John?
Yeah, is that a trick question?
I think that was a trick question.
I knew I'd get a laugh out of him. That's why I asked it. So I just thought that was a little bit on the light side that, they got hacked and that actual combination was in the data dump. I was like, wow,
I
that's
absolutely
crazy.
Hey,
On
plus
the-
one password length.
On the absolute lightest note, if I can close this out with one more story, just to encourage everyone to tune into HGTV. I don't know how many weeks the series is running, but HGTV went out and bought the real Brady Bunch house that was used at the beginning of the show, just an aerial exterior view, and they have reconstructed it and refurbished it to actually look like the real Brady Bunch house on the inside, which was just a series of sound stages 50 years ago when I used to watch it on TV.
Right? That's a pretty cool hack. I mean, that is kind of like a hack, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very cool hack.
Marsha.
They're
There's
all
some
in
cool
their
photos in this
60s
article, by the
now,
way. It
which
looks
are-
very familiar.
But
I
now,
watched-
what's interesting though is when we talked about passwords a moment ago, on not so light of a note, the how a nearly forgotten physicist shaped your internet access. Dr. Corbato recently just passed away at the age of 93, and created in the 1950s, according to the article. Lee and Jeff, you may remember, you're probably out of college by then, but he says, with multiple users sharing one computer, in the first multi-user operating system, it sounds like they were describing, files had to be assigned to individual resources, researchers, and only available to them. That led Dr. Corbato to develop the password system in a system now familiar to everyone. Every user was given a unique name and a password, and their files were stored in a way they're available to only that user. That was in the 50s.
Wow, Marsha Brady did not age well. Sorry, I had to say that.
Well, she's like 62 years old.
3.
So Dr. Corbato's solution was to develop an operating system called the Compatible Time Sharing System, or
CTSS.
CTSS.
Paul, but seriously, find a picture of Jan Brady and tell me if you don't think she looks like Cindy Gula.
Okay. All right, we'll do that on the break. How's that?
Okay. All right.
And with that, we'll take a short break and come back with our in-studio interview with Peter Smith from Edgewise. Stay tuned.
NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email at contact@netsparker.com. Recorded Future. They help security teams make more confident decisions faster. Recorded Future's technology automates broad collection and analysis of cyber threat data and delivers the rich external context you need to understand alerts and emerging threats. With real-time threat intelligence from Recorded Future, security teams respond to threats 63% faster and find undetected threats 10 times quicker. To get started, go to recordedfuture.com/securityweekly and sign up for the Recorded Future Cyber Daily. Every day, you'll receive an email with the top results for trending technical indicators, cyber news, exploited vulnerabilities, suspicious IP addresses, and more. Subscribe today and stay ahead of cyber attacks. Endgame's converged endpoint security platform is transforming security programs, their people, processes, and technology with the most powerful endpoint protection and simplest user experience, ensuring analysts of any skill level can stop targeted attacks before information theft. Endgame unifies prevention, detection, and threat hunting to stop known and unknown attacker behaviors at scale with a single agent. For more information, visit endgame.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. I'm very excited to introduce no stranger to the show. Peter Smith is the founder and CEO at Edgewise, a microsegmentation company. And I'm just very excited to talk about the Capital One hack and AWS security aspects that I had actually stumbled across in the past couple of weeks. And Peter and I got talking. He's like, oh, yeah, we can totally do that attack and defense on the show. I'm like, sweet. So, Peter, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's going to be fun.
It is going to be a lot of fun. And I think we started this whole thing basically based on themes that we've been talking about on the show, one of which is the all-encompassing term cloud security, which just it means more things every day as Amazon adds new services, and now Google and Microsoft have their respective services in the cloud that are offering more and more things every day. It seems like every time I cover even the enterprise security news, there's a new service being spun up. To our benefit too. I mean, there's a lot of looking at our own technology and others, like it makes sense to put a lot of this stuff. We just did a webcast with one of our other sponsors, Logarithm. They put their whole solution in the cloud, and just there's so many interesting things. It really is not even the future of security. It's where security needs to be today. So Peter, I'll let you kind of set the stage for what we'll talk about today.
Yeah, I think we know quite a bit about the Capital One breach. We know what it impacted: 100 million people in the United States, 6 million people in Canada. We know a bit about how the breach occurred and the timeframes. So,
what's interesting, different from Equifax, it wasn't like someone just was running some vulnerable software somewhere. It wasn't as easy, or it's not as easy, but more traditional. It wasn't a traditional attack like that.
Yeah, that's right. They took advantage of some things that we haven't really seen used in this way before, notably the AWS Instance Metadata Service, along with a server-side request forgery. And then they parlayed that into S3 bucket access using tokens that they found in AWS. So it's really fascinating. And the fact that we know so much about who it was, how it was done, and sort of what level of sophistication was used to accomplish the outcome, it wasn't mind-blowing. It's just taking advantage of things that are available to you by default in many cloud services.
Sure.
And this is by no means to pick on AWS.
No,
these sorts of things exist everywhere.
Yeah, and it just so happened I was reading an article about secrets managers and how to manage secrets within your application, as I'm getting ready to implement that and talk about it more on the shows. I read a great article that was using the Amazon's API gateway. And the way I understand secrets managers to work is, yes, it stores all of your secrets, but you need some type of key in order to unlock those secrets. The benefit being, yes, someone could get that key, but also you can rotate those keys a lot more easily when you're using a secrets manager. Not only the keys, but your access to those credentials can be rotated and all that stuff. So I don't have to store my API keys somewhere on my file system in an environment variable inside my source code, God forbid, right? I can store those in some type of secrets vault. But the trick is I still have a key to manage. And the article was talking about using, which I had not seen before, the AWS metadata service, which has some type of key or token, and using that as your key to gain access to the secrets vault and then use the API gateway to do that. And the article, and I thought it was, I'm like, this is great. It's one less key I have to worry about. I can just go pull it from my instance and we're off to the races.
Yeah.
And then Peter came along and kind of shattered all of that for me from a security perspective. But it's important to note, as if I'm reading articles about this, other people are too. So it's very timely.
I think you touched on something earlier about the cloud that is really highly related to this, which is there's a certain element of convenience with the cloud. It's about when we adopt the cloud in Edgewise, there's elements of cost efficiency, of not having capital expenditures. There's elements of velocity of the development organization to do more faster. And, convenience is at the core of a lot of those arguments. And so you see things in AWS that are designed for convenience, but could potentially undermine security. And I think, unfortunately, the metadata services is one of the main ones. And we'll get into it.
When you put it in that context, it's, I could spin up all my own services to do this, and very likely have probably, well, if it's my code, a lot more vulnerabilities in that. But the convenience factor is I can use those services in Amazon. I give up some control, and I hope that they provide me with enough control that I can keep it secure. But a lot of times that's a configuration option, or in some cases, maybe it's not a configurable thing with what the cloud provider is offering. Therefore, you need third-party tools to come in and help control access between things. Authentication and roles, essentially, is what it's coming down to in the cloud.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. So you want to see some stuff?
Yes. Well, first, so let's back up before we get started in the demo portion. The AWS instance what is that?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of attributes about an AWS instance. And what Amazon did, it's super clever. I'm really, really impressed by how they thought through it. What they do is they aggregate all of these metadata attributes. So what security group are you in? What's the host name of the instance? What's the MAC address? What's the IP address? So on and so forth. There's just a large volume of attributes that you can have assigned to a given instance. And here's the trick. If you are on the instance and you point anything at the network address 169.254, 169.254, port 80, and you do an HTTP request, it'll give you a directory structure. And that directory structure will enumerate all of these attributes. Now, if you go on a different AWS instance, it will only see the attributes specific to that instance. So you need to be on the instance.
EC2, or does it translate into other services, or just we know? So I haven't looked into it either.
It's interesting. Yeah. I can't claim to know whether it is beyond EC2, but it is in every EC2 instance that you go to this address, the link local address, and it gives you all of the metadata about self.
Right. So I can see in Lambda that being not as useful.
It's too specific not to be a feature. Or what was the original intent of why did they put this in there?
That's a good question. Amazon,
it's a great question.
Amazon uses it, right?
For Tons of things use it. When we look at this, you'll see there's a very large amount of systems that use this, and I think maybe it was a simpler way of doing quick lookups that didn't require direct API interactions. It didn't require you to have a developer key or to learn an API. It was simply querying for a URL, getting a response back, and knowing what that value meant. It's
almost like environment variables, but in this sense,
that's a great way of.
But environment variables can be overwritten and stomped on. In this case, you're getting a read-only basically copy of.
You know what? I really love that analogy, because just like environment variables, you really do need to think twice about what you store in it. You're not going to store the root password in an environment variable. That would be a crazy thing to do.
You know what, though? When you're deploying containers, environment variables are used all the time, sometimes appropriately, to get data inside of the container, dynamically sometimes, or from your build. But people are storing all kinds of bad things they should not store in environment variables.
I love the analogy. I think it's totally spot on. Yeah.
Cool.
It's in lieu of having config files. You just go read, instead of reading a config file somewhere, you go read these things out of the off that service.
Right.
You don't have to do any file I/O. You just run a URL and get what you need, and you don't have to remember it because that's your nodes move. You go from regions, whatever the hell. Your app knows where it is just by asking.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Now-
here's the rub.
Go ahead.
They don't have any way of controlling access to it at all.
There
And
is no access control.
There is no access control. It's just a HTTP request that's not authenticated, not encrypted, anything. And they actually, in their documentation, if you can see my screen, the documentation has an important warning. And I'll just paraphrase it for you. There's one line that's underlined here. It says, anyone who can access the instance can view its metadata. Therefore, you should take suitable precautions to protect sensitive data. And really, the question is, it's great to have a warning, but how?
Yeah, how do you protect it?
How? That's not answered here. And I've done some searching, and frankly, I haven't found a solution.
Interesting.
And we're going to try to see if we can come up with one.
Now, also when you're going to mirror the Capital One attack, and in that they use a server-side request forgery.
Yeah.
Recap for our audience, and quite frankly myself, the details of that type of attack.
Yeah, so I'm going to put out a contrived situation. It's not that contrived. Let's pretend like you had a server that was composing widgets. And the way it composed the widgets, and the widgets were hosted by other servers. There was a web app that had a config file with a list of widget URLs that it was supposed to bring together into a single page. So it iterates through that list of URLs. They've got a little proxy function in their app that goes and fetches the data and presents it in a combined view to the user. Okay, well, the little proxy function, that's not such a bad thing as long as it's internal and private. But imagine if it weren't. Imagine if you were to pass the URL equals parameter with any URL, and your web app goes and fetches that data and presents it to you. So let me actually show you what I mean.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So rather than tricking a client to visit a URL they weren't intending, you're tricking the server to visit a URL
Exactly.
they weren't intending. Okay.
Effectively treating a server as an intermediate proxy that will request anything that you want. So I'll show you right now.
And server-side request forgery. Yeah.
So what I'm going to do here is start.
It's not just a clever name, Paul.
Yes, it is very meaningful. Yes,
I'm going to start a little Python server, and come over
Don't
here.
ask questions, Paul. Just let him run the demo.
Is it,
Oh no, ask questions.
is it
please.
Python?
No,
2?
he's going to ask you Python questions.
Is it Python 2 or 3?
So I am assuming this is 2, because it's on a legacy system in my test lab. So anyway, I'm going to point my browser at this this server here.
I just did that to satisfy Jeff's requirement of me asking a Python question.
Got it. So what you can see on my screen now is that my happy little corner of the internet, my web page here says, welcome to my home page. This is the default page. Now, that little proxy function that exists in this web app, let me show you what it looks like. I'll quit this and we'll just, this is basically pseudocode. All we do here is we use Flask to do a route on your root directory.
Oh,
And-
intimately. When I told you I was coding all day, this is what I was coding in Python and Flask. So,
So what we do here is we basically say fill URL, or URL is the request argument URL. And when we create a response, we basically just string this together. And if the response gets content from that URL, it'll use that as the response. Otherwise, it'll
that's
use
really
the
bad,
default
because
page.
that means
it's
user,
stupid
yeah,
stuff. You should
right.
never do this, right?
Users could put whatever value they want, and you would go out and request
Of course.
that URL.
And so let's
Right.
do that, right? Let's just, I actually have to run the service to make this work.
Created your own proxy server, basically.
It's a proxy server, yeah. And there are legitimate reasons to do stuff like this, but it really has to be internal only. But with this, I can just hit pass in google.com, And guess what? Here I am. I'm on Google, but via this little proxy app. Well, what about the AWS metadata service? If I were to go in there and I said, you know what? Sure,
That's how they did
I
that.
could point it at Google, but I could also point it at the link local address. So let's do it. 169.254, 169.254. There it is. That is the list of directories at the root of the metadata service. And I could say, you know what? I want latest. You can get dynamic information, metadata information, or user information. And I want metadata information. Now, I'm not going to spoil the surprise. We're going to look at this in a different way.
If that's internal only, why would you make that parameter and even put it in the URL? You would just make that internal to your own object. Because I'm thinking when I do it in my code, I send parameters, but they're object attributes. They're not something the user can manipulate in a parameter.
That's why I was using the example of a service that brings together multiple widgets into a single page. It was an ill-conceived design,
Right.
or simply a mistake of exposing the proxy function.
Yes.
But the point is, these sorts of things exist in people's code all
absolutely.
the time.
Yeah.
The question is, do you know if they're exposed or not? And that isn't even the worst part of this story.
It's not necessarily easy to find either.
Not necessarily
Right.
easy to find, but let's take a closer look at, this is one of three problems. Problem one was a server-side request forgery. Problem two was that it could access metadata.
They
So-
didn't restrict, even if you're going to make that available for some requirement in your app, you would restrict which URLs it could go get, not just any.
Absolutely,
I gotcha. Yep, yep.
absolutely. So let's pretend like I had access to the server. So let's get out of here. And I'm on the server. Maybe the SSRF isn't even the means by which the connection happened. Maybe I'm on the server and I'm an interactive user. I do a curl. 169.254. Okay, there it is again. I can navigate this directory by just doing this. And I can see all of the data that's there. Well, what other things could I use? I could use wget. I could use a Python script. Here's a Python script, right? I can look at get host info. So this is just a set of print statements that does the request get statement to look up the local host name, the local IPv4, and the MAC address. And when I run this, what it does is
It's written in Python too, by the way, Paul.
Yes.
what it does is prints out a pretty printed version of the host name, the address, and the MAC. That's for legitimate purposes, but you could also do it for illegitimate purposes. How about being super subversive? Let's just use Python. Okay, so I get into Python. It is an interactive shell, relatively benign, except really I can do anything. Let's import requests and then do a print requests get and then say HTTP 169.254. I hate typing this address, by the way. The numbers are like all over the keyboard. And then we say text. Okay, there we are. So we're in an interactive Python script loading one import and able to query this thing. And let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes. We could do latest, metadata, identity. Actually, let's look at what is at the root of metadata. You can get AMI IDs, you can get host names, events, device mappings, instance ID information, MAC address, metrics, network placement, all of this stuff. But notice security groups, you can enumerate the security groups the object has, and identity credentials. So let's dig a little deeper into that. So we're in metadata. Let's go into identity credentials, then EC2, and then security credentials. Okay, security credentials for the EC2 instance. Let's look at that. EC2 instance. Oh, what is this?
Interesting.
This right here is a secret access token that I could, I don't know, maybe do you think I could get this through the server-side request forgery? Let's copy that URL and paste it in here.
Of course you can.
Of course, I have to run the server. So let's quit this and do that. Come back here and see what we get. There it is. So as a remote user with a server-side request forgery, I can pass in an internal URL, which is the AWS metadata service, and grab access tokens out of it. And if this access token had access to the S3 bucket with 100 million US citizens' private information, I now have that, and that's how it wound up on a GitHub repository. And by the way, that's why
The data did not.
That's
any of
why-
it. They didn't access Git and get the source code. They
no,
figured, yeah,
so they were notified in July that the data had been published.
leaked. Yep.
It had been taken from the S3 bucket at the end of March. And this is the result. This is the lawsuit against Erratic, who did this. And those were roughly the means by which it occurred. And the question I have is, how do you stop this? This isn't a one-off thing. There will be vulnerabilities in your code. There will be the ability to get either interactive access to the host or indirect access via issuing queries through your broken application. How do you stop gaining access to this critical metadata? How? And the point that I really want to raise here is that there is no answer here.
Right.
There is a suggestion that you put appropriate controls in place, but there isn't a specific answer. What I want to do is find the answer.
Yeah, because one could just say, well, in Capital One's case, they just shouldn't have a SSRF in their app, but that's the just fixing the like one of the symptoms, right?
Yeah,
it's not
exactly.
curing the underlying issue that there is basically unrestricted access to a key, which then could grant you access to something else.
A multitude of information.
Right.
I know the key is super overt, but understanding the security groups, understanding a lot of information that's available there is a piece to the puzzle. That
Jeff,
happened to be the whole puzzle.
It feels like Active Directory, right? In a sense. Sorry, Jeff.
In a little way, it is right. You're publishing some internal data. Incidentally, it's actually worse, though. I think
it is.
Well, in a lot of ways, because just from a request directly from the server. I mean, there's so many ways as a developer, as you know, to screw this up. And inadvertently open up that level of access. That it seems a little irresponsible on Amazon's behalf not to put some sort of access control around such a facility. But anyway,
Jeff. Hold on, Jeff.
So I have a question. I'm not even sure how to ask it, but because you might have said it already and I missed it, but how on any given server or instance or whatever we're talking about does putting in an IP address, which, my old-fashioned way of thinking ties to a system, how do you get an IP address to respond regardless of how, what system or what instance you're looking at? Could you flesh that out a little bit for me?
Good question.
That's what I think is so clever about the service. It is not a host-driven operation. It's in the fabric of their network, and I can only speculate how they accomplish that. But likely, what is happening is the metadata service is looking at the MAC address of the device, correlating that to an instance ID, determining what the actual instance ID is, and then presenting all of the metadata for that instance, reflecting it back to the instance. That is likely the mechanism they use, but frankly, I just don't know.
Yeah, because the TCP/IP stack is on the host, not the instance, right? So they control basically everything. In whether you're running an instance, whether you're running a container, or very similar, right? They're controlling the underlying network, right? The stack is not really inside that; it's on the host or virtual hypervisor or whatever it is, right?
So to clarify, this particular IP address, and I'm looking at some write-ups on it I Googled it, and it looks like it's at least a segment that's somehow dedicated. This is all AWS. This is
It's all EC2 instances anytime an instance communicates with the link local address, which it's worth noting the link local address is a non-routable address. It's only available within the broadcast domain, the layer 2 broadcast domain of the device that it's the network it's plugged into. So we use link local for MDNS as an example. So when your device magically sees another device on the same network, that's typically driven by Apple used to call it Bonjour, multicast DNS. Yeah, that's all link local. Yeah, and they reserved a link local address for use in this metadata service.
That's what I'm curious about. I mean, in the old days, I would take an address like this and look it up in the domain registry and see who actually owns the space. I'm assuming 169.254 because that's up in the
That's the
here's
the DHCP reserved.
Actually,
right?
this is a really interesting.
Well, reserved is
non-routable.
It is
non-routable.
Non-routable address space.
It's a non-routable address space that is not statically assigned. It is dynamically assigned. And the way it works is when you don't get a response from DHCP, for instance, you will claim an address or pseudo-claim an address and broadcast out who has this. If no one responds, you take it. And basically what you're doing is using ARP to determine whether the address you have or want to have, you have exclusively. So because that's the means by which link local is assigned, if they reserve 169.254, 169.254, then really all they need to do to prevent conflict is to say, make sure if you ever receive an ARP request for resolving this, that you say, nope, I have it. And then no other device will ever attempt to take it.
Interesting. So that in DH, it works even though
DHCP fails, and it's about random.
Because I've claimed the host has claimed that address, therefore it won't be assigned to any other system.
And by the way, that's the reason it only works on a single layer 2 broadcast domain, because your ARP request won't span. Without some sophisticated bridging, your ARP request won't span the broadcast domain. So when you say, I want to be 169.254, 169.5, you do the ARP request, nobody responds. You say, okay, now I am. So if somebody else comes back on and they say, well, I want to be 169.254, 169.5, you respond saying, no, that's me. And therefore, if they're compliant, they will not attempt to take it.
Choose a different address.
It's an interesting concept. My understanding is it seems like it was backported from V6, because V6 had this idea in its inception with FE80 prefix, and 169.254 kind of got backported into V4. I don't think it existed early on, but then it, because in V6 they had the ICMP mechanism instead of address resolution protocol. The same kind of thing plays there, where there's link scope local. It's legit what they're doing. It's just the fact that they have a link scope local server that's advertising out metadata. That's the weird part.
Right.
With no access controls. You can't apply a security group to control access to this. And even if you could, they're literally saying anyone who can access the instance can view its metadata. That means any user who gains access to it, any software that happens to be running on it, either software that you know is good now or is bad tomorrow. Just because you have good software on there right now and you can say, no, it's safe. It's only good software running on the instance. Yeah, right now.
It's almost
it is quite similar to... in fact, it's worse than this, but there are some analogies here to link local multicast discovery, or formerly NetBIOS, right? Same sort of thing. It's a local broadcasting mechanism where you could discover a lot of information. Multicast DNS is similar in that respect as well. You can discover a lot of information, but it's one thing to advertise just sort of one particular aspect of information, such as some DNS host identification structure. It's a whole nother thing to advertise an entire metadata structure that goes way beyond just one particular aspect of interesting data. That takes it to a whole nother level.
And this could be accomplished in containers as well. It's almost like they created their own network, right, in Docker, which is a resource, and just assigned it to every single container that you deploy and put a service up that you can access with no authentication. I mean, storage and Docker works kind of a similar thing. They're just basically virtual resources.
So the question is, how do you stop it?
Yeah.
Any ideas?
My first gut reaction actually is on any host that I would deploy in an instant is just to flat firewall it. Just drop any traffic to that address.
That would break a lot of things. That's the problem. So, for instance,
yeah.
Oh,
well, no,
oh,
'cause-
yeah.
Well, you were saying
Actually-
AWS uses this service.
So, let's see, the SSM
Wait, why?
SSM agent uses it. The EC2 config uses it. There's a lot of services that are tangled up in metadata. And in fact, the first question to ask yourself is, what is communicating with this service?
Right.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
And that alone is a very difficult question to answer. So let's answer it.
So Amazon doesn't give you as the user a way to monitor or restrict access to this service.
You can look at flow data and you can see that every single instance in your environment is communicating to 169.254, 169.254 port 80. What good is that? Everybody is doing it all the time. I need to know what software tried to do it.
Right.
Then the onus has to go back on Amazon. They've got to implement some sort of API token key or something for access control here. They have to.
Well, I'm actually wondering, would you implement another level of security beyond, so you got the key to access your S3 bucket, but then you need something else to manipulate the data within it.
Well, it's reading data, not manipulating, right?
Yeah. I mean, S3 buckets is just one example of the IAM role that may have been associated with that credential,
right?
With that token. So it's easy to just say, well, for S3 buckets, let's do something more. But this is a pervasive problem. Like, is that access to RDS? Is that what is it access to?
This is the identity of the instance, essentially.
Right.
It actually highlights the general issue that exists with cloud, and that is that the control plane is moved into software.
Yeah.
And when the control plane moves into software, there's ways to abuse it, right? And this is one of potentially many that are going to exist, right? It includes software-defined networking. To use a cliche almost term, a classic example, right? If you can control the control plane itself and reroute traffic, that could be bad, right? So yeah, it's a toughie.
It's a toughie. So let's figure out what talks to metadata. And what we're going to do is use Edgewise. So what you saw is that I've got a broken web app that has this SSRF.
No, it works. It's just not secure. I wouldn't say
it works.
It works.
Yeah.
It's functional.
It is a flawed web app.
Flawed, yes.
Very flawed.
It's got a feature. It's got a feature.
It's very functional. It's a functioning proxy server. It's awesome.
Yeah, no, yes, yeah. And unintended. So we've got this flawed web application. I can run any administrative tool, whether it's curl, wget, an interactive Python shell. If you're on a Windows box, you could use PowerShell, whatever the case is.
Yep.
And what I need to do is lock this down so that only my good stuff, like my ability to say, get host info. I use this. I need this. You can't take that away from me. So some of these structured scripts that need access to metadata, they should have it, but nothing else.
Right.
So let's figure out first what is communicating and then lock it down to only the things that should have the access. So what we're going to do is get into Edgewise. And the first thing we'll do is just take the all managed hosts object. And the all managed host object is just every instance in your environment. We're going to say view connections. And viewing connections, what we can see if we expand outbound paths.
So you have the Edgewise agent on this instance.
Yeah, exactly. We've deployed Edgewise via SSM actually to all of these instances to make it nice and simple to deploy. So there's a lot of outbound connectivity. I'm just going to go to unmanaged paths. These are addresses that we don't directly control, like the 169.254 address. So I'll say 169.254, 169.254, and this is a list of all software and devices that communicate to the link local address throughout the entire environment. What I'm going to do is just do a spot on this. So you can see PowerShell on desktop 3 connected, Kubelet on Testa 1 connected. We've got the Amazon SSM agent, which is the configuration management agent for Amazon. You've got the EC2 wallpaper. So on a Windows box, this is desktop 4. The desktop will have like information about what the instance is, its size, and all of that. Well, that's where it gets it. EC2 config does. So let's just select all and go through the list quickly. I don't want that. I don't want my subvert get Mac. I've been playing around quite a bit, so there's a bunch of cruft in here. SQL EIP. This is how SQL Server does customer experience improvement, CEIP. They get information about your instance and they send it to Microsoft. So that's gone. I'm going to take my server, which was the flawed web application out. I'll take out interactive Python, interactive PowerShell, gone. I'll leave the pilot agent. I'll take out my test, my script. I'll leave Kubelet. I do not want Internet Explorer to be able to access it. I'll say get Mac is gone. I'll say get host info, which is the one that I use. It's important to me, stays. I'll leave EC2 wallpaper. Why not? Get rid of curl. And I'll get rid of a bunch of test garbage that I was playing with.
Now, conceivably, if an attacker had a shell, they could find a way to get access to this.
Not in a minute.
You're going to take away the shell as well,
I'm
right?
going to take everything
Gotcha.
away.
Okay.
So the only thing that we'll be able to communicate is we're going to create a segment. And this is going to be a segment, a list of software. So I say create source segment.
In your product, you can say this Python script has access, but the shell...
that's
cool.
what I'm about to do.
That's really cool.
Seriously.
Yeah, I like that.
So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call this AWS Instance Metadata Clients. And I'm going to say create. And in just a second, it'll refresh and you'll see the object here. There it is, AWS Instance Metadata Clients. So this is every instance in my environment and every piece of software that will be allowed to communicate with the metadata service. So the first thing we need to do is put a default block in, right? Just like a firewall, you say, by default, I don't want anyone to be able to talk to the metadata instance unless approved. So the way we do that is we go to sentence policy builder, and we take the all managed host object, and literally we just say local unmanaged, expand it. It shows the link local address right there on port 80, and we say block. And then we say, okay, now AWS Instance Metadata Clients. What I want to do is I want to say local unmanaged 169.254 approve. So there's two policies. It's simple. All managed is denied to 169.254, 169.254 port 80, and AWS Instance Metadata Clients is allowed. If you are not in that allowed list, you do not talk to metadata. So we're going to apply.
So I got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
I first of all love the fact you can do this, on scale, but how's that any different than what I said? And what I said was I drop a firewall rule in to stop traffic to that port, that service, right? That's what you're doing.
Yeah, with a very significant difference, which I'll show you right now.
Okay.
So we can actually chat about it first. The main difference here is that a firewall can say, this address is or is not allowed to talk to that remote address and port. What we say is this specific script, this specific application, this specific binary is or is not allowed. I can say PowerShell as an interactive shell is not, but this foo.ps1, this specific PowerShell script is. I can say Python as an interactive shell cannot, but getData.py is. And that's exactly what this is all about. So let's see what this looks like. So
Okay, I'm sold already.
so let's do it. First, we'll start with get host info, my little Python script. Okay, that worked. Excellent. What if I did Python interactive, and again, I did import request. Gotta learn to type first. Import requests, and then print requests get, and we do HTTP. And text. Ooh, what is this? Interactive
really cool.
shell just got a permission denied for
awesome.
accessing the metadata service. Now, what if I took this one step further? What if I was clever and I said, you know what, that script that was allowed?
You want to edit it. That's where
wanna
I was going.
Own it. So what I'm going to do is I'll copy this script and I'll say subvert.py. I'll go here and I'll say yank it, put it, and change it to, I believe it was local IPv4. Oops. Great. Nope, permission denied. What about curl?
But now, if you edited the gethostinfo.py,
Doesn't matter.
If you change the
Let's do it.
Does the signature change?
Let's do it.
does the signature change?
Let's do it. Permission denied.
So if you just edit that,
Yeah,
and-
I'll do
and
the
add a
exact
line.
same thing. Yank, put.
Oh, you didn't save your changes though.
Yeah, you did.
Oh,
Yeah,
you
I
did Q bang.
Yeah, no, there's 2 lines now.
Oh!
In
Your
case there
screen
is-
is cut off. Your screen's cut off. I'm
In
sorry.
case there is any question, let's just do this again. Yank.
It's
put-
on the upper screen. It's shifted, so I couldn't see the
Yeah.
I couldn't see the W.
No problem. Get host info. Nope.
So
Sorry.
it knows that file changed.
It knows everything. Let's go one
That's
step
really
further.
cool.
Let's do
I
one
didn't
step
know it
further.
did that. That's really awesome.
I'm going to start my little flawed web server.
Yes, your flawed web server.
My flawed web server. And I'm going to come over here, and the first thing I'm going to do is copy this so I don't have to type it again, and say, great. So the proxy still works.
Right, you can go to Google.
Yep.
Sure.
The point of this solution was not to stop that, but what happens if I point it at metadata services? Nope. Sorry, permission denied.
It's awesome.
Wah, wah.
So that took me, how long do you think it took me to build 2 policies and narrow down a list of the things that should be allowed to
Yeah,
communicate?
I mean, even if I had to watch a video of you doing it and then go do it, it's still not that long.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, that may have taken 5 minutes out of my life I'm never getting back.
Right.
Come on.
Yep. So literally,
No, it's cool.
there isn't another way to stop access to metadata services. It's this, and I don't know if this is kosher, but I'm gonna give it a go anyway. Seriously, between now and the end of the month, if you saw this on Paul Security Weekly, and you go to our website and fill out the request demo form and just say, I saw the AWS thing on Paul Security Weekly, and you say, I want to protect my AWS metadata services, we will give you a package for AWS that is a fraction of the price of the full-blown microsegmentation solution. It'll be a no-brainer decision.
That's awesome.
That's very cool. So, operational question. You've got everything locked down, which is awesome. And so I'm developing code, and I updated my Python scripts. How big is it a deal to say, now these are the real ones, update all the signatures?
Trivial. So scripts are a little bit different than binaries.
Oh, well, whether I change the script to the binaries,
Yeah. So I'll show you. So there's two things. For binaries, we actually have a patent on similarity scoring to be able to automatically group like objects together. That's what this little Stack Overflow icon is here. So if I select this guy and open up the sidebar and show application details, what you can see is there's actually two distinct instances. There's a SHA-256 of Python 3.6, which is different than the SHA-256 of this other Python 3.6. So two completely different binaries, but executing the same script. So the binary changed, the script didn't.
Right.
We look at all of the cryptographic properties. We do some fuzzy match comparison, and we merge those together so that there is zero administrative overhead. When you make those changes, you see these little Stack Overflow icons pop up, and that means we have automatically merged the identities for you. Now, script level changes, because they are so easy to change, what that would be is if I come to this app collection, AWS instance metadata clients, I can do one of two things, or two of two things. I can come in here and modify the definition simply by selecting the script, or we have something called register CLI, which allows you to register the SHA-256 of an executable. So for instance, if I had a continuous integration and continuous deployment infrastructure,
my scripts are changing
the
all
last
the time.
step of the CI/CD pipeline is register CLI, putting the SHA-256 into the list of trusted software automatically. So really simple to integrate into most DevOps processes. You could do the same thing with a configuration management system as well.
Right.
Well, thank you for asking the question I didn't manage to answer, because that was next on my mind. It really was. I was thinking, shit, how do I enter? Never mind. Yeah, you got it.
So that's it. That's it really is that simple. Like, we've got this big problem, and
Make it harder. Make it harder.
Yeah, I'll try.
Said no developer ever.
That was an awesome demo.
Cool.
Loved
Yeah,
it.
very nice.
Very
Very
cool.
nice.
The fact that we don't have questions and we're sort of speechless right now is very telling. It's very, very telling.
No, I mean, you guys have you've nailed it by connecting the application, the process, to the actual traffic flow. Hence the word microsegmentation. That's exactly what needs to be done. So.
By the way, if those processes were containerized, nothing changes. If those were containerized processes, again, containers are just attributes on a process ID that assign it to a namespace. From our vantage point, it is still just software. You apply software to software. If it's containerized or running on bare metal or running in a VM or an AWS instance, it doesn't matter. It's software. We apply the policy to the software.
And when I deploy my containers, I can update the ID, the hash.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and by the way, I should note that if I come down here and I say enable auto update, what it will do from this point forward is look at the definition, 9 applications on all managed hosts. Well, what that actually means is it will allow this list of software to access metadata services on any host that is an EC2 instance now and in the future. So you don't have, when you provision new instances, this is completely automatic. It automatically updates.
Carries forward.
Yep.
Right. So what's the overhead on the individual instance?
It's not zero. It's never zero.
You would not be able to measure it. I would be shocked if you could. I would be shocked. So one of the Fortune 500 company on the West Coast that deals with a lot of tax information, I can't really say who it is. They are a customer. They hammered our system with very high volume backup traffic. What they saw was 0.1% maximum CPU usage. Max.
Right. I asked the question because so often when we're talking about improving security on systems, the big pushback is, well, you're going to add more overhead to running my system that I'm paying for by the cycle. Okay, I'm being a little bit general there, but you know what I mean. And when it's 0.1% overhead, it's really hard to do the pushback. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. We built it the way we built it to be suitable for high frequency trading platforms. Our latency, the latency we add to make a control decision, under normal operating sort of strain on the system is somewhere in the 5 microseconds range. It'll stretch up to 10 microseconds if it's under heavy load. So we're talking about, just to put that in perspective, those numbers might not actually mean anything to anybody. A typical NGFW will make a control decision in around 100 to 125 microseconds. We make a control decision in order of magnitude faster.
Yeah, that's not to mention developers making changes that introduce a lot seconds, not microseconds, right?
Yep.
Right. I mean, your user's not going to be responding to microseconds of delay. They're going to respond to seconds or even half seconds. You're way below the I'm going to notice threshold.
The point-to-point latency of a 10 gig Ethernet connection from an application through 10 gig, I don't know if that includes a switch. It may or may not. Is 8 to 10 microseconds.
Wow.
So we're literally talking about the speed overhead or latency overhead of one of the fastest network fabrics you can buy.
You're struggling not to say wireline speed, aren't you?
It's always a struggle. The struggle is real.
Well, I mean, again, I go back to when developers change code, you could introduce some really I mean, I've done it in our own application, right? You do something, you're like, oh my God, that just introduced 5 seconds plus is really noticeable by the user.
You know how you fix it? You build a little proxy,
right?
And you try not to make sure that it's exposed publicly.
Build on a proxy, Paul.
Right? Yeah, I think database, what I'm struggling with now performance-wise is database commits, right? Anytime you write to the database, that's a huge performance. I don't know if you have the stats on that, right? But it's significant. So if you get programmers that are sloppy and you're like, oh my God, like every time they're doing something, they're writing to the database. That's probably more common in applications than we'd like to believe, right? Or maybe we do believe that, but
definitely in the milliseconds range.
Yeah, for sure, right? And those add up too. So,
and if it was one of my queries, it would be in the seconds range.
That's what I'm going through, right? Yeah. Yes, Jeff. Jeff, you're muted, my friend.
Sorry about that. And I had such great things to say. I'm curious. So, we're sort of teasing Paul a little bit about his coding. He's teasing himself. How does a developer that's working for a smaller company that's either working directly in AWS or it's going to end up in AWS, how do they make use of all this in a practical sense?
All this being AWS or Edgewise?
All this being Edgewise, what you guys are offering.
Well, I think for a small organization taking on microsegmentation, you always need a starting place. And frankly, I can think of no better starting place than what we just saw. It is a glaring wound that needs healing. And it's simple to wrap your head around what are admittedly novel concepts. I don't think anybody has seen something like that before. I mean, I haven't. And so I think you have to wrap your head around the idea that you apply policy and allow access between software and solve a real problem while doing that. This is a really great example of doing that. You learn the platform, you learn this new mechanism of control, and you actually add value to your security program. What more could you ask for?
Yeah, I think your ability to buy like just this small chunk, right, is great. is a great start. Because I had similar questions, because we are a small, like Jeff, we're a small shop. We're looking at hiring another developer, but we're small, but we still have those security requirements. So,
yeah, I think another aspect of this is visibility. Really, it's still quite hard to understand what really is happening in your environment, especially when it changes so frequently and rapidly. And one of the elements of what Edgewise does is full topological mapping of the environment. So you can map out every piece of software and device communicating throughout the infrastructure, and then group them into higher level business constructs. And in fact, the machine learning system will do that for you. If you're willing to let me show you very quickly.
You did that demo before. That's a great point to Jeff's question. Auto microsegmentation, is that what you call it?
Auto segmentation, yeah. So when you're looking at visibility, for instance, you might care about just looking at paths. So if I want to look at paths, I could say, let's view connections for Active Directory. I can look at that at 3 different levels. A top level, which is really about the group of Active Directory servers. And from that vantage point, I can see all devices and software that communicate in and out of Active Directory. Now imagine this was a PCI environment and you have an auditor coming in. Well, instantaneously...
like Jeff's our resident PCI expert. So
you're saying Jeff's magic words.
Mm-hmm.
You have a view of everything that communicates in and out of the PCI environment. You can go one level deeper. You could say, I want to know about the host. And if you really wanted to, and again, expand it and you can see everything that communicates in or out. If you want to go one level deeper, get down to the software level. Do you want to know what talks to your LSAS process that's inside your PCI environment? Well, you click on it and there is a list of every piece of software and every device that communicates. Now, all of this data is that's 3 levels of vertical visibility, but you also have horizontal visibility. And what I mean by that is, let's say I wanted to see how LSAS interacts. So LSAS on accessed from desktop 01, SVC host is what's communicating with it. Well, I can go horizontally expanding as well. So I can see RDP scan communicated with SVC host, which communicated with LSAS. And you can expand that out 5 degrees. So I can literally look at 5 degrees of attack paths that ultimately arrive at a given service. Now, tying it back to what you were actually asking, that's about groupings. That's about specific topological questions. So let's rely on machine learning. I want to know about a front-end service for my business application. So I expand machine learning and I say, you know what, show me host segments that contain my load balancer front end. Okay, there it is. So there's an object here that contains this server. And it grouped together, here's another example. It grouped together all of these systems because they represent the business object. I can now look at the topology of the business application without having to do the groupings myself. The machine learning system did the grouping for me. The last thing I would say is, so you get this automated grouping of your business applications, you get a full topological view, you get the ability to control at a software level, and you get monitoring that fully integrates into your SIM. So the actions that we were just taking, let's look at those. If I look at enforcement events as an example, and I look at allowed from desktop 4 EC2 config. Well, let's expand that and see what it is. Well, this is an allow connection from EC2 config on desktop 4 using this address going to the metadata service, and this is the policy that caused that to occur. So we're telling you why things occur, and we make all of this data available to your SIM. So let's say you wanted to take the opposite. I want to know blocks that occur against metadata service. Literally all I do is I say subtype equals blocked, and I say I want to know for a specific target or whatnot. I can see every single block action that occurred and why it occurred, and all of this data is pumped out into your SIM via an integration that downloads these JSON objects and imports it into the common information model of the SIM. So all of this data is available to you instantly in your SIM.
That's really cool.
I love the way you actually avoided saying SIM of the SIM there. Um,
That gives me chills even thinking.
Uh-oh. Now you've done it, Joe.
yeah,
So,
no, I have.
so are there other environments that have the metadata risk beyond AWS, or is this really only an AWS phenomenon?
My understanding is it's becoming more common. It's admittedly a very clever service.
Yeah.
It
Oh,
just
yeah.
to be
No, it's-
it has to be handled carefully, and so clever things tend to permeate, right?
It's functional like your flawed web application.
Yeah, it's
So-
functional.
So, but what if I rang you up and said, I think I got this same problem with, say, Azure. How big a deal is it for me to deploy your solution on Azure?
It works no differently. We can deploy automatically through group policy on Active Directory or through SCCM, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, SaltStack, SSM. Any configuration management you have, we have a script for you to do instantaneous deployment. You instantly get the visibility. You instantly get the ability to build those two policies to protect it.
If you implement that when you deploy new resources or systems to Azure, or Google Cloud, or Amazon, the agent collects that information, right?
Exactly. And it's worth pointing out, this isn't even just about metadata services.
No.
Think of RDS. You've got an RDS service endpoint. And what that means is that things can communicate with it that shouldn't be able to. Use Edgewise to make sure that it's only the specific Java jar that is supposed to talk to RDS that is talking to RDS. And you can sleep soundly at night knowing that nothing else can communicate with RDS. Nothing.
So you can't put an agent on RDS. You put it on the things that should be allowed,
Exactly.
and then
And you say all your EC2 instances,
Yep.
they by default may not talk to RDS. Well, except for foo.jar or script.python,
Right.
.py.
And only the right version of it. So the reason I was asking is because as we've been focused on what this would value to the smaller business, but I know a lot of the larger ones are doing a multi-approach. They get not just AWS, they've got Azure, or they got AWS and Google or whatever. And I was thinking that if the same answer worked for multiple environments, that makes it a win that's so much better for everybody.
What I would actually do is I would say take the app collection, get rid of the machine learning recommendations, and I would have all of these cover every piece of software on every device independent of cloud platform. And then
Right.
simply build one policy from that list for AWS, one policy from that list for Azure. It's still working on one list of approved software that should be able to communicate with metadata services.
right
And
across all your cloud providers.
Across all of your cloud providers.
And then hook it in so when you're deploying to any cloud provider, it automatically gets that policy.
You don't
Right.
need to maintain multiple lists here. Maintain one list.
Right.
We're downshifting to KISS, which is important.
Very. Especially
Yeah.
as complex as managing all those cloud services.
No,
I mean, think about managing security groups alone.
Yep.
This was
Yeah,
easier
yeah.
than managing security groups.
Right.
I was about to say, if you go back and contrast with the traditional firewall deployments, the biggest challenge, and probably most of us in this room, quote unquote, virtual room, have been some sort of centralized firewall administrator sometime in our life, and classification of those assets and managing all the little groupings is a total pain in the ass. I mean, I don't know anybody that did that well, and eventually cracks form. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Today it just becomes obsolete. You can have
Right.
the best managed firewall in the world, but how do you manage your resources within any cloud provider, let alone across multiple cloud providers? Because the air quotes firewall is now, like Peter's saying, it's security groups now that you have to manage on top of your firewall. So think about how many cracks exist in
Cloudy firewalls.
Yep.
Well, I think a
what they
lot of us have been saying for years, the closer we can push that security boundary actually to the edge, to the application,
Right.
the better off we are. Well, Peter's just shown us how we can do that. So,
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, well done.
Thank you.
That's all I can say.
The other huge part is you've set this up, and you could go through it with somebody in about, I don't know, 20 minutes, let's say, and they'd understand what's going on in a repeatable way, as opposed to it being still black magic after multiple hours of going through it. That's huge for success.
If you are an AWS customer and you contact us and say, I want to protect metadata services, I guarantee you, if you use SSM, we can fully protect your infrastructure and AWS metadata services in a 2-hour phone call from start to finish.
It's awesome.
It's a big statement. Yep.
Where's my stopwatch?
Bring it. Bring it.
Very nice. Very nice.
I love it. Thank you.
That was awesome, Peter. Thank you so much. And it's edgewise.net if you want to go there and request a demo. Say you heard about the AWS metadata protection here, and special treats will await you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome. Love the segment, Peter. Thank you so much. With that, we're going to take a break and switch to some pre-recorded interviews that the team did at the Social Engineering Village at DEF CON this year. So stay tuned.
The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is unprotected attack paths that allow threats to compromise vulnerable targets in the cloud and data center. But traditional microsegmentation is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation, delivering results immediately with a security outcome that's provable and management that's zero touch. Driven by machine learning, Edgewise automatically builds policies that protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network. They provide measurable improvement by quantifying attack path risk reduction and verifying software identity before it communicates to stop application compromises and data breaches. To see how to eliminate your network attack surface, visit securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. Qualys is introducing a new prescription for security, and it's free: Global IT Asset Discovery and Inventory. Activate it today at securityweekly.com/Qualys so you can achieve 100% near real-time visibility across your hybrid environments.
Welcome to Security Weekly. I'm your host, Matt Alderman. We are recording live from DEF CON 27. We're at the Social Engineer Village, and joining me for this interview is Chris Kirsch. Welcome.
Good morning. Hi, how are you doing?
Good. I'm great. Your talk was on cold reading.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to talk cold reading.
Yeah.
But let's start. What the heck is cold reading?
So cold reading is a technique where you're trying to make other people believe that you have psychic powers, right? So it's, I don't claim to have any real psychic powers, but these are techniques that have been, passed down the line, and there are books about this stuff on how you can make people believe that you can predict the future, read their mind, give them advice about their life, and so on. Yeah.
Got it. And now you did a really interesting experiment.
Yes. So I read a book about cold reading. I recommend, if anybody wants to get into this, it's Ian Rowland's The Full Facts book of cold reading. It's still available. And he gives a very good overview, right? And I read it and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. But then I wanted to try it out. And it's kind of weird to go to you could go to your family members and friends and so on, but I already know them pretty well. So I didn't want that to taint my experiment, right?
Okay.
But I also didn't quite want to go up to random people on the street and say, hey, I'm a psychic. Can I do a reading for you? Because they'll think I'm completely nuts, right? So what I did is I work for Veracode, and they organize 3 days of hackathons twice a year.
Okay.
So hackathons are different things to different companies. For us, it's a little bit like think of it as a mini DEF CON, right? So there's like escape rooms and like this and that. And
you're bringing in customers and prospects, or?
No. This is, you can work on anything you want.
Okay.
There's only 2 rules. So you have to either learn something new or work with people you haven't worked with before.
Okay.
So the psychic readings was both. I was learning something new, and I was working with people that I hadn't met before.
Right.
And if you've seen my pickpocketing talk from Layer 8 that I gave, that also started at a hackathon. Meeting new people, learning new skills, right?
Okay.
So so I advertised that I would do psychic readings. I didn't disclose up front that it was a cold reading, that it was fake, right?
Okay.
Because that would have influenced the experiment. And a few of my colleagues were looking at me a little bit strange. But, that was the risk I had to take.
Right.
And so then I did, I think it was like 8 readings over the course of 2 days. It's not a crazy amount, but I actually found it to be extremely draining from like a mental exercise, because I had to hold up a conversation and kind of like read a lot of social cues and process these and think about how do I package those up so that they sound like a psychic reading.
Oh.
So there's actually a lot going on in the background, because I wanted to give kind of custom psychic readings rather than a stock one, which is also surprisingly effective. You can just write a generic one, rehearse it and learn it by heart, and then give it to everybody the same, and everybody will kind of find their own identity within it, right?
Got it.
But I wanted to go a step beyond that. So that was the part that was a little bit more taxing.
A little challenging,
Yeah,
because you're sitting with a person you don't know.
Yeah.
you're having a conversation, you're processing, trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to make this reading work and make it believable,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Because that's the
Yeah.
trick here,
Yeah.
is making it believable, where the person sitting on there sounds like, well, how did he know that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And there's cold reading is not just one technique; it's actually a whole collection of different techniques, and a lot of them are super interesting. And the reason why I wanted to learn about this is number one, because it's a wacky thing to research, and it was really fun. Number two, because I think there's a lot of crossover to social engineering and so on. And in my talk, I actually talked about a lot of applications, direct applications for.
Well, I was going to ask you the same question.
yeah.
How do you apply in a social engineering setting then?
Yeah. So let me go back to your earlier question, right? Like how did the reading work? So I started out and I asked people, have they had a reading before? I was trying to gauge the
kind of their experience.
Their experience and their level of skepticism,
Okay.
right? Because that's really important. So I asked people, so have you had a reading before? And some people might have said like, oh, I did one once and so on, and I'm not quite sure. So those are the maybes. Then there are some people that said like, oh, no, I'd never do that. I'm just doing this for fun. And then there were some people that were kind of like, had been going to psychics for 20 years. So I had the full spectrum, right? And that was really important to me because I needed to know kind of, number one, I wanted to make that part of the experiment, like their predisposition coming in, and then how they came out and how that changed their view. The skeptics were really hard to convert. The maybes were actually the easiest to work with. They could be convinced either way, so it was easier to sway them.
Yep.
And the hardcore believers kind of fell into two camps. Some of them said like, hey, I don't believe you have psychic powers and you need to, or like, you need to train a little bit more kind of thing, right? And that was fine, right? And I was doing this for the first time. I don't claim to be like a professional psychic.
They were telling you to hone your skills.
Exactly. And then there was one person who, even after I told her that I didn't have psychic powers and revealed the methods that I used, she still said like, oh, but I do believe you have psychic intuition. And she was really into it. I couldn't convince her of the opposite.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Interesting.
It's very interesting, yeah.
So now, how do you apply these techniques to social engineering then?
Great.
You know, where does that fit in?
Yeah.
And because I think it's an interesting part to get somebody to believe something, right? And so how does this, how do these skills kind of transfer over?
Yes, sure. So I gave you the example earlier of gauging the sitter, right?
Yeah.
And let's say you are doing a vishing call as part of a social engineering exercise, and you're trying to figure out the technical savviness of the person on the other line, right? Because you should know that before going in, because if they have no technical savviness, you can completely BS the whole conversation, and they'll believe anything.
Right.
If they have a very high technical skill set, you might have to adjust a little bit, right? The risk is higher. You have to tread a little bit more carefully. So you could ask as part of the IT support call to say like, hey, I'm going to walk you through this and I'm going to help you through this, just so that I get a sense for your technical expertise. Are you more of like a regular Outlook user or Office user, or do you go into the advanced settings and drop down to the command line once in a while, right?
Yeah.
So this is kind of like giving them two options and having them self-select and gauging their savviness to go in, right? And that gives you a good indication of how to shape the rest of the call.
Interesting. Yeah. So using that technique kind of guides you down the path of getting the information that you want at the end of the day, which is credentials or whatever, right? Exactly.
Then I had I printed out from Google image search some astrological chart. I don't know where it came from. I don't know what it actually does. And I printed that out and said, all right, we're going to get started in a moment. And what I would like you to do to start out with is I want you to close your eyes, take a pen, put it on the paper, and draw lines across the chart, right? And in any shape or form, and you're done when you're done, right? And that was kind of like in the social engineering world, that was my pretext, right? I was setting up the why and how, and I told them about like how I'd learned this from my grandmother in Thuringia, like she's from Eastern Germany and so on. And so I also had them write down their date of birth, trace their hand on the other side, and write the initials of somebody of significance to them on the back. And then, so that was kind of my pretext. Most of that stuff didn't have any impact on my reading, but I was always referring back to it and looking at it and so on, right?
Trying to make them believe that it did.
The date of birth and the initials actually did play into some later rounds that we can talk about in a moment. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And then as a next step, so what we learned about that for social engineering purposes is, really sell it. Like even if your pretext is kind of like a little shaky and it just came up with it on a whim, right? Really
just go
sell
for it.
Right? Just really go for it. And if you've seen the documentary on the Fire Festival, like channel these guys.
Right.
Really bad idea, but boy did they sell it, right?
They sold it. Yeah. Yeah. That's true. They did.
Yeah.
All the way to the end.
And then I would ask people. So if after they told me like, have you had a reading before or not? And then let's say they haven't, right? I would say, so let me provide my perspective on, how this works and give you a little bit of an intro, right? So the things I see, I can't quite steer them. So, you can ask me for a certain direction, but it whatever comes.
Right.
And it also might not all make sense to me, but I need your help to interpret it.
Oh,
right?
I see. Yeah.
So that means, number one, you are setting the precedent that, hey, you might be wrong or it might be the right information, but we just didn't interpret it right.
Yeah.
So you're giving yourself
a little
multiple outs.
Yeah, just in case.
Absolutely. And also, you're making them do the work, right? You throwing something out there, and they have to interpret it.
And you actually get them to refine it for you.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So in an SE context, let's say you are going in completely cold. You've done no research on a target. You might walk into an office and say, "Hey, somebody asked me to fix the cables in one of the meeting rooms, and fellow about this tall, nice guy, short brown hair," and then somebody else would say, "Oh, you probably mean Richard," right? So they provide you the information.
Right.
They're doing the work, and they've just confirmed to themselves that Richard asked you to go and check out the conference room, right?
Yeah.
So you try and do the same thing and have them do the work.
Got it. Yeah. So you said date of birth mattered and the initials mattered. How did that come into your
So that
script?
came in at a later part. So I did one thing where I looked up the 3 most common first names, both male and female, for all the decades since like 1970s to the 2000s. And I had that on a little cheat sheet. So when they were writing down their date of birth, I looked at their year and then looked at my cheat sheet. And in I think it's like the 90s and 2000s, for example, 2 of the 3 most common female names are Jess and Jen, or Jessica and Jennifer, right?
Yeah.
So if it's a woman sitting there, I would pick female names, and if it's a man, usually male names.
Right.
And then I'd say something like, I'm sensing that there is somebody of significance to you, somebody you haven't been in touch with for a long time. And they, you've thought about reaching out to them, and they want to connect back with you. So I'm getting the sense, I'm getting the letter J, like a Jess or a Jen or a Jessica or Jennifer. Does that, like, who is that person? Right?
Yeah.
And so you're fishing for that, and about half the time I got a hit on those. Right. So you're just playing with the probabilities.
Right.
And when they said, no, don't know any Jess, don't know any Jen, I don't know what you're talking about, then you can use an out, because a psychic is never wrong, right? You can use an out, and you can say, I get a really strong sense that this person has a big influence on your life. And so if they haven't come along yet, then please make sure to look out for them.
Oh, I see.
So you're doing a time shift, right?
Yeah.
You're going from past to future, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't in the past, then it's somebody that's in the future.
Yeah.
Recommendations for anybody on how to use these skills, because I think you talked a little bit about recommendations in your talk as well.
Yes. So you can use it for SE, right? I have applied some of these things to for salespeople, right? So sometimes instead of one thing that's very strong in cold reading is don't ask questions, but make statements.
Okay.
Right? You're coming across a lot more like you actually know the subject matter. And so if I'm saying, and I'm using a random example here. Oh, your AWS bills, I hear your AWS bills are very high, right? Either they'll contradict you if it's wrong, right? And say, oh, no, I don't think so, that, right? Or they say, oh, yeah, and they think like you already know their company and you know their problems and so on, right?
Yeah. builds that confidence
Yeah.
with the customer and
Yeah.
gives your salespeople a
Yeah.
little more confidence in,
Yeah.
in building a rapport, a relationship with
Yeah.
the customer. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll come back soon. Welcome to Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman. We are recording live at DEF CON 27. We're in the Social Engineer Village. Joining me for this interview segment, Micah Zenko.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so you want to talk about non-cyber red teaming. What is non-cyber red teaming?
Sure. So most people know of red teaming as like advanced pen testing, which
Yes.
is trying to get to the most valuable thing that someone is trying to protect by emulating a motivated adversary. But red teaming also is applied in a lot of private sector, military, and nonprofit world, which is essentially doing what are called facilitated brainstorming exercises and crisis management simulations to think through the consequences of your strategy, of your plan, of your processes, because the whole theme of my work is you can't grade your own homework. So just as you don't know the vulnerabilities of a defended system, you don't know the vulnerabilities of your plan. So it's pen testing in a different way, but basically trying to pen test the thinking behind your strategies and plans.
Got it. So I was thinking you're going to go down a slightly different path, so I want to throw this out and say, is this also considered non-cyber red teaming? So I worked, first part of my career was nuclear power, and then I spent a little bit of time at one of the refineries. And one of the things we had to do was prepare for risks like a hurricane coming up the Gulf coast and hitting New Orleans, because BP at the time they have a big refinery down there, and that's a non-cyber incident.
Yep.
When you think about it, right? It's a hurricane, but if it floods the plant, how do you prepare? Business continuity, disaster recovery, etc. And when the hurricane hit a few years back, my guess is they pulled out my disaster recovery plan,
Of course.
to restore the plant, because those systems don't change very often, right? And so when you think about non-cyber red teaming, that's a red team kind of exercise. Think, what happens? What do we do when this happens? It could be an earthquake. It could be a lot of things. You talked about strategy, which I thought was interesting as well, because I think more of the natural disasters when I think about something like that.
But I would say yours is red teaming. That's crisis management simulations.
Okay.
Because every organization has playbooks and run books for all sorts of disasters. Most of them, they don't test. They don't test rigorously. And even in the cyber world, the default is go to the CISO and say, what do we do? Most decisions actually have to be elevated to the C-suite level. They take on account commercial interests, your customer needs, your partners, and it is not a CISO decision. That's like one of the things we do is we force C-suite and board level people to really think about the implications of political miscommunications by the CEO. You have a massive data breach. You have a natural disaster. We've done this with mining companies and stuff like that. So it turns out their playbook isn't very good. And the only way you really test roles and responsibilities and build trust and relationships between people is in actual crisis-like simulations.
Got it.
Because you don't build trust in crisis, and roles and responsibilities go out the window unless you practice them.
Yeah, true. I think Jason and I and Paul talked about this a couple weeks ago on Business Security Weekly about the roles and responsibilities when there's a crisis between the board and the management team, right? Because the board needs to have oversight and understand what's going on, but they're not the ones, or shouldn't be the ones, that are actively involved in the activity when something happens. And there has to be kind of those liaisons to keep both teams in check. Same would apply here, right? Because now I have executives, but I might have line management that is responsible for aspects of that crisis management. There's roles that vary, and if those aren't structured well and put together and tested, when you're in an actual crisis, it's probably just pure chaos.
Boards get quarterly briefings from CISOs that are mandated, and they sit through them like it's a hostage briefing. They have no interest in what's being said, and they don't really retain any of the information. The way boards learn about cyber threats are from peer networks and from news reporting.
Yeah.
And from software that they hear their friends have bought. Right. So that's how, like, incident detection software, that's what they think cyber is. They don't really know what the CISO does or what her concerns are and what the team and the bandwidth is and the attack surface. And I can just tell you in situation after situation, you find out that organizations are less well prepared because when the crisis hits, they literally don't know what to tell the marketplace. They don't know what to tell the vendors. They don't know what to tell third-party law enforcement in particular. I mean, like, if you don't have a go bag of what you can share with Secret Service or FBI on day one, you are way behind the curve. The biggest organizations in the United States don't have that today.
Interesting. So what are some of the recommendations for those organizations where they don't have this? What do they need to do?
At a basic, you have to have a playbook or a run book that is developed and known to every relevant stakeholder. Because it's not just enough to have a crisis communications people like, what is the tweet you craft? But what is a tweet you craft when something takes into account a range of different interests in the company? What do you do when, again, law enforcement comes to you with information about a breach, or you get that middle of the night email from Brian Krebs that says, oh, guess what I found?
Right.
Available for sale on the dark web, which happens quite frequently. And you'd imagine like people don't know how to reply to Brian Krebs, right? So if you don't have that, if you don't have that nailed down, you're way behind. So practice your run book, practice your playbook, because it's not just for that actual crisis. It actually builds shared consciousness around the problem set. It builds trust generally, and it's better for your organization having done the tests than not having done the tests. So you don't do it just in case that thing happens. You do it because it has benefits beyond just that specific crisis. But most organizations, it's a preventative activity, hard to demonstrate ROI, so it's the first thing that gets cut.
Right.
Or you get 1 hour every 6 months, maybe. At a tabletop exercise with board members, and it's just forgotten.
I think a really good example of this is the Boeing 737 MAX incident, right? Because they mishandled this thing from day one. They could have done a way better job, similar to what Johnson & Johnson did way back in the day with the Tylenol scare, right? And we, again, these are articles we've covered from a leadership communication perspective because I think they're interesting stories to understand. So when something goes wrong, how do you react and respond to it and build confidence and trust back to your customers or whoever that, yes, all right, something happened. We're going to pull the planes off. We're going to check everything out, make sure everything's okay, maybe do a software update and get them back on. But they didn't do that, right? They misstepped all these different places. And then they decided, oh, we should pull the planes and redo this. They lost so much credibility by doing that because they weren't prepared for that kind of incident.
But they also weren't honest about what they knew and didn't know. One of the best examples of this I've ever seen, if you ever seen the Merck CEO, when Maersk, the shipping company.
Oh yeah, the shipping company, the container.
When they got hit with ransomware, the CEO sent out one statement to all employees: make sure customer needs are met, no matter what, we'll accept the cost. Period. That was like in the military they call commander's intent. This was the simple message that everyone knew and could repeat and drove behavior down to the lowest level of execution.
Right.
And so they didn't claim they knew what they didn't know. They didn't know the scope of the attack. They didn't know if they had it contained. They didn't know when the system would be clean. And so they just said, keep doing what you're doing because that matters more than anything else. And they lost a ton of money, but they didn't lose credibility. They didn't lose customers. They actually gained customers because when it came down to it, they were willing to absorb the costs rather than transfer them on to their customers.
Yeah, which is great ancillary to the previous story because, the Boeing one sticks out in my mind as just really, really mishandled.
Yeah.
All right, we got a couple books.
Please.
So I got to get my book stash out. So the first one is Red Team, How to Succeed by Thinking Like the Enemy. So this goes right into the discussion we just had, kind of the non-cyber red teaming kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of that, but it's also why you need to red team, which is, again, organizations are systematically incapable of identifying their blind spots, challenging their assumptions, knowing their vulnerabilities. That's true in the cyber world. That's also true in everything organizations do. You can't grade your own homework. You have to have an independent, semi-disinterested individual or team which red teams your strategy, plans, and processes again. Because on your own, again, you ask me if I'm good looking or smart or charismatic, don't believe me. Because I have no reason to be honest. I don't know that. People are really unself-aware. Same with companies.
Got it. Second one, clear and present safety.
Yeah, so this is an antidote to contemporary fear-mongering about the state of the world, which is if you read cable news, you listen to political leaders, you think things have never been worse. In reality, on every quality of life metric, things have never been better for a greater percentage of people on Earth. That's a really positive thing. A lot of this looks at why that is, how to sustain that as a foreign policy, but it also turns national security on its head and looks at the things that actually harm Americans, which are all domestic, overwhelmingly based upon opioids, car deaths, gun deaths, pedestrian deaths, the decrease in social mobility. The challenges that the rest of the world are coming out of are getting worse here. And America is becoming, I would say, a less developing country relative to their peers very quickly. So instead of thinking about how to protect Americans from threats and risks abroad, we basically look at what actually harms Americans today.
And it's us internally.
It's us internally. It's all within our borders. And we have evidence-based interventions to improve life and safety and health and well-being here. And we choose not to prioritize it the same way we do overseas.
Oh, interesting. Micah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.